Okay, we'll start again. Good morning and welcome to the 20th meeting of the Education, Children and Young People Committee in 2025. This morning we're taking evidence from the Scottish Government as part of the Education and Skills cross-portfolio session. We're also joined by Liz Smith, MSP, who I will take in to ask her questions once all committee members have spoken. Can I welcome to the meeting Jenny Gilruth, Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills, Graham Day, Minister for Higher and Further Education and Minister for Veterans, Natalie Dawn Innes, Minister for Children, Young People and the Promise, and the Cabinet Secretary and the Ministers are joined by their officials. So can I welcome Graham Logan, Director of Learning, Claire Hicks, Director of Education Reform, Andrew Watson, Director for Children and Families, and Stuart Gregg, Deputy Director, Governance and Assurance Division, Lifelong Learning and Skills, Scottish Government. Welcome to you all, and Cabinet Secretary, I understand you'd like to make an opening statement, so over to you, Cabinet Secretary.
I'd like to raise a point of order. I raised this with the convener in the private pre-briefing. I don't think it's appropriate, convener, for you to be conducting this meeting from the Caribbean. I think it doesn't make you look good and it doesn't make this committee look good. And I would like you once again to reconsider whether this is appropriate, and I would ask you to hand over the responsibilities to the Vice-Convener.
Thank you very much, Mr Rennie. I will do that because standing orders allow me as convener to take part if I have been in part of the session. You will know under standing orders if I don't convene any part of the session, I cannot take part as a member. So if Ms Dunbar is ready and prepared as Deputy Convener, I am happy to hand over to her and I will ask my questions when Ms Dunbar would like to raise them, but I will be here for the duration of the session. I can hand over to Ms Dunbar if she's ready.
Sorry, I'm a bit confused. Are you taking part in the session, convener, or
I am, because
listening?
I now can take part in the session because I have started the meeting. But if there are concerns, I'm going to listen to the concerns of members, and if this is going to make the meeting run more smoothly, then I'm very happy for you to convene the meeting, and I will come in when you decide,
Okay.
Deputy Convener.
Can we maybe suspend just for a few minutes till I get advice from the clerks, because I'm not sure of this process, never having done it before. So I'll suspend until 9:10. Ready. Thank you very much, and my apologies for suspending the meeting, but I had to get advice from the clerks. Under Rule 12.1.12, it says where the convener is not available for any meeting of the committee or leaves the chair for part of any meeting, that meeting or that part of the meeting shall be chaired by the deputy convener. Where at any time other than during a meeting of a committee a convener is unable to act as a convener, the deputy convener shall carry out the functions to the convener. The rule makes no distinction between virtual or in-person attendance during committee meetings. It is the role of the convener to chair the committee if they are present, whether in person or virtually. So with that, I will hand back to the convener to convene the meeting virtually.
Thank you very much, Deputy Convener. And can I now invite the Cabinet Secretary to make her opening statement? Cabinet Secretary.
Point of order, please.
I'm sorry, I did allow it, but I've been advised there are no points of order in committee. So I understand there are issues.
There is another option, convener, that you could leave the meeting. You could leave the meeting and allow Liz Smith to be your substitute. That is, I think, a sensible way. You have indicated previously that it wouldn't have been appropriate, following the point of order that I made, for you to convene the meeting. That's not technically possible. What is technically possible is for you to leave the meeting and Jackie Dunbar could take over convening the session.
Well, unfortunately, you're not correct in that Ms Smith, who would be an excellent substitute, she would not be allowed to act as a substitute because the Scottish Conservative substitute for the Education, Children and Young People Committee is Ros McCall. Ms Smith has been asked to come along because she sought my agreement to ask questions. I have heard your concerns. They're on the record, Mr Rennie, but I would now like to go to the Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Convener. I'm pleased to be joined by my colleagues Mr Day and Ms Don Innes this morning. And let me start by setting out some of our key work across the committee's remit and to acknowledge some of the challenge. In childcare and support for families, we have expanded ELC to 1140 hours and we continue to work with local authorities to reach more eligible 2-year-olds. We are investing in 23 early adopter communities across 6 local authorities to design new childcare offers for children from early years to the end of primary school, targeted at families most at risk of living in poverty. Our £3 million Bright Start Breakfast Fund will create thousands of new Breakfast Club places, and just this week we announced more investment in our Extra Time programme. Across Scotland's schools, we've reset the agenda post-pandemic through the National Improvement Framework to focus on our ABCs, attendance, attainment, additional support needs, behaviour and the curriculum. We are prioritising investment in these areas in our joint commitment to increase teacher numbers and in our behaviour action plan, and we continue to speak directly to stakeholders to inform that work. As of yesterday, I've engaged directly with every single head teacher in Scotland through our Head Teacher national events, and I pay tribute to them today and to all of Scotland's teachers and school staff for the care that they invest in our children every single day. Now, you will note from the latest statistics from December that they show the highest levels of literacy and numeracy since records began, as well as the lowest ever attainment gap in terms of literacy between the most and least disadvantaged pupils. This year's settlement with local authorities has provided a 3% real terms uplift for education, and we continue to have the best paid class teachers, the lowest pupil-teacher ratio and the greatest spend per pupil across these islands. In further and higher education and skills, we've worked to support colleges and universities through extraordinary financial challenges influenced by factors out with the control of this Parliament. Ministers listened closely to the sector as we developed this year's budget, and we're investing over £1 billion in university teaching and research in 25-26. Since February, we've made an additional £25 million available to support the sector. Mr Day chaired the cross-party discussion with University Scotland yesterday on the future of the sector, and we both look forward to continuing to close working on this. Crucially, and unlike the rest of the UK, we have also ensured that university tuition remains free. And all of this is complemented by an ambitious reform agenda across our education and skills system, strengthening and rationalising our curriculum, assessments and qualifications landscape, simplifying the funding arrangements, and with that focus on improved outcomes for all learners. I will close there, and I hope I've set the tone for a collegiate session with the well-being of Scotland's learners at its heart. Convener.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Can I begin with a question to yourself? Do you believe that principals in Scottish universities receive a salary that's appropriate?
As I understand it, principal salaries are set by our independent university autonomous institutions, but I think the point the convener is making, which was raised at committee last week, is the issue in relation to restraint, and I believe that restraint should be exercised in relation to salaries, particularly mindful of challenges in terms of other salaries and a cost of living crisis and the optics of that to other staff.
You're absolutely correct. These are independently set, but obviously the universities that set these salary thresholds receive funding through the Scottish Government. What do you think would be an appropriate salary for someone, leading a university, not any individual university, but if you think they should show restraint, what would be the level of restraint they should show?
Well, I'm mindful, Convener, that in terms of salaries, of course, ministers are currently subjected to a pay freeze ourselves, though we've now moved to take the MSP salary, which is a shift in our position. But we've taken that position, I think, to show restraint as a government and mindful of the pressures that people are facing. I think it would be remiss of me as Cabinet Secretary or for any minister actually to comment on the salary levels at independent, autonomous institutions. I'm very mindful, for example, of the challenge that we face in relation to one institution at the current time that we, I'm sure, will come on to discuss. So I don't think it's for ministers in the government to talk about salary levels in independent institutions. But I do think the point you make in relation to restraint is an important one. I know that this issue was dealt with previously, for example, through letters of guidance from the government. That might be something that the Minister and I wish to reflect on, given the committee's evidence from last week's session.
And how would that work? Could you explain how a letter of guidance would work and how that would, with remaining your neutrality, allow you to offer guidance?
So as I understand it, it was previously undertaken through somebody who sat in this position historically in relation to the letters of guidance. Stuart Gregg might want to say more on that point in terms of how we might be able to stipulate for that. But it does relate to the letters of guidance which we issued to the SFC usually at the start of the year. But I don't know if Stuart wants to say more on that point and how we could specify.
Thank you. So I could just add that the letters of guidance are between ministers and the SFC or SDS, set out the priorities that ministers want to see exercised. So in that context, there could be some clear messaging about ministerial expectations in that regard, but not specificity.
Thank you very much. Could I move on slightly, Cabinet Secretary, but remaining with yourself to discuss the...
Sorry, Convener. Mr Day may wish to come in finally on this point before we move on.
Okay. Sorry, Minister.
Hopefully helpful, Convener. As I mentioned in front of committee a couple of weeks ago, we have had a direct conversation already with the chairs of the universities in Scotland, simply encouraging them at this stage to exercise restraint. That would be with uprating of remunerative packages going forward in view of the challenging financial circumstances and the cost of living crisis. So there has been a conversation of sorts already had around exercising self-restraint and self-awareness.
Okay. Thank you all very much on that. Cabinet Secretary, could I move on to the issue of growing violence in Scottish schools? And could you perhaps, I've seen some of the media coverage, but explain and outline the reaction you got from Scottish teachers at the EIS conference last week? Because certainly some of the headlines were quite stark about perhaps there is a feeling that the government weren't listening to the growing concerns of teachers about physical violence and abuse in the classroom. You look puzzled, so maybe that didn't happen and it was the way it was written up in the papers. Well,
I spent a long time at the EIS AGM on Thursday evening, a long time actually, with members listening to their concerns, but also with my official who I'm looking to in relation to some of the points you made, Convener. In terms of the views of teaching staff, they've been central to all of my work as Cabinet Secretary. And in the course of the last year, as I alluded to in my opening response, I've spoken to every single head teacher in the country, which has not been without challenge. I think your point about engaging with them directly is important. The issue of behaviour, I have directly addressed at every single one of those events, and we had a robust discussion about that at the EIS AGM. I think more broadly, one of the points I made in response to this point when it was raised was, across our society, we see challenges in terms of aggressive and violent behaviour. We see that playing out in increases in relation to misogyny. We see that even in politics. So it shouldn't really be a surprise to people that that's now happening in our classrooms, and we should look to connect those two issues and try to tackle them jointly, as opposed to saying that these are narrowly issues only within our classrooms. And in terms of teachers' engagement, of course, the EIS and our other professional associations have been at the forefront of helping to formulate the National Action Plan, which I launched last August. That's part of the solution here. I accept it's not the totality of the response that is required, because I think schools can't do this alone. So the National Action Plan is starting to have an effect in our schools. You will also be aware, Convener, that in addition to the National Action Plan, we are going to publish before the end of this term updated guidance in relation to consequences, but also in relation to violent incidents in our schools, which I think was the premise of your question, around about risk assessments in particular. And I want to be absolutely clear that no teacher should experience violence in schools. They should not be in fear, for example, of that happening in their classroom. We have seen in recent weeks, you gave examples, I think, from press articles, but we've seen examples of some really challenging cases in recent times that give me great cause for concern. So I will continue to engage with the teaching unions on this, to listen to Scotland's teachers who have been at the forefront of this, and also to provide the funding that's required. And you will also be aware that the government's budget provided for extra funding for teacher numbers and for additional support needs staff. That is imperative to providing that wrap-around support to classroom teachers in particular in a school community. So we need to work with CAUSA as well to that end. I'm sure we might come on to talk about some of these points in more detail, but to me having that workforce is really fundamental to tackling some of the challenges we see in terms of behaviour. There are other points I'd probably like to make in relation to mobile phones and gender-based violence, but I'm aware that we have a limited time today, so you may want to come back on some of those points.
We may get into some of those points, but just remaining with violence in our schools, in the Education and Skills portfolio questions last week, we had a discussion about a case, which I won't go back into that particular case, but you did indicate that you would be willing, or you will be, having a joint discussion with the Cabinet Secretary for Justice about consequences. So how will that happen? What will be the process? Is there a cross-ministerial working group in terms of consequences of particularly violent and aggressive behaviour, where the public are perhaps believing that adequate sanctions are not taken when there is abuse and violence against teachers?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point you raised, Convener, on consequences has been raised with me consistently by the profession, and there are a range of consequences at teachers' disposals. But at the current time, for example, we know there's reticence around the use of exclusion. For good reason, I understand. It should only be used in the most extreme examples of challenging behaviour, but it is a consequence at teachers' disposal, and it is ultimately up to them and their professional judgment to exercise whether or not that is appropriate. So it's not for me as Cabinet Secretary, for example, to instruct that. But the point you made about your question last week, Convener, is very live. Tomorrow we will have the second Youth Violence Summit, along with the Justice Secretary. I'll be attending. We'll be engaging on a cross-portfolio basis to the point that you have raised in relation to consequences. And of course that will feed into our work on consequences, which we'll publish, as I said, before the end of term.
Thank you very much. Could I move to the Minister for Further and Higher Education? Minister, can I ask, and I know you will provide a full response, but we are now several weeks on from the committee's report in terms of widening access, and there was a cross-party unanimous agreement that a unique learner number should be introduced. I've picked up from you in the past, a willingness to look at this. Will the government go any further than simply looking at this? And what options are there for the government to fully introduce a unique learner number?
So you're right, Convener, I will respond to the committee's report in detail, but I'll update you today insofar as I can. My officials have continued to explore this over the last 2 months. That's included meetings with University Scotland, the SFC and the Commissioner to understand the specifics of how this would work in practice. We've also, my officials rather, have also had a meeting with the Information Commissioner to garner his thoughts on that. It is fair to say that this is extremely complex work. It's very cross-cutting in nature. It involves the sharing of personal sensitive data of millions of individuals. So you'll appreciate that this needs to be done properly. I can't go beyond that at this stage, but I hope that gives you an understanding of how seriously we take this matter and that we are exploring it actively.
But you have been exploring this for a number of years, is that fair to say?
I think on and off it has been there, certainly predating my time as well. But I think we're taking an increasing focus on this, not least of all because our university colleagues believe there's some merit in it. That said, it is not without its challenges. This is not a straightforward thing to do.
Okay, thank you. And I'm conscious of time and I want to get to other members. Could I just ask one question to the Minister for Children, Young People and the Promise? Minister, there's been a number of questions to you in the Chamber about nursery provision and particularly local authority nursery provision and potential closures, lack of consultation. I think the Government have now been clear that consultations must be held. Has there been any breakdown in communication between what the Scottish Government expects and what local government is delivering on the ground in terms of consulting over the closure of nurseries?
I think from the correspondence between a specific local authority and the Government, there has been some level of miscommunication there. However, the Scottish Government have written to that local authority to try to set out the guidance and more clearly to try and overcome that miscommunication. And I believe we're waiting on local authority further reaching out. I think, you know, as we've been very clear, as I've been very clear in the Chamber and the First Minister has been clear, we are further reviewing that guidance. But equally, as I say, at the moment, ensuring that local authorities are aware of the guidance as it stands currently.
And on that further review, is there a timescale for when Parliament and local authorities will be updated on that review?
Well, the work is underway and officials will be seeking input to the process from stakeholders over this summer. So that will be the next stage of that process.
OK, thank you all. As I say, there's lots of questions, but I want to get to other members, and we'll go now to Jackie Dunbar.
Thank you and good morning. Thank you for attending this morning. If I could come back to the Minister for Children, Young People and the Promise, just because it was touched on in the last question. I know that we're all looking forward to hearing more about the Promise Bill as it comes forward. And I do appreciate, Minister, that you will be limited in what you can actually tell us today. But can you perhaps outline the progress that has been made in some of the key policy areas in recent months, you know, for example, foster care, kinship care and the social work area?
Absolutely. I'll perhaps start just by saying, as Ms Dunbar has stated, I am unable to go into a huge amount of detail on the bill, but I just want to put on the record, as I stated at the last committee session, my intention to bring forward a bill to Parliament to address some of the legislative aspects of keeping the promise, and this is still the case, and I will be introducing this bill prior to June. In June. I'm very grateful for the committee's patience with this, and I look forward to discussing the bill further with the committee once you've seen the full details on it. Regardless of waiting for the introduction of the bill, I'm sure Ms Dunbar and other members will be aware there has been a range of activity in relation to delivering on the ambitions of the promise. So in relation to foster and kinship care, I think Ms Dunbar mentioned, there has, as I say, a number of actions have been taken. So we announced the Scottish Recommended Allowance in August 2023. That has made an impact for foster and kinship carers. That was backed with £16 million of government funding. We have then, as a result of the cost of living pressures, ensured that we've uplifted that this year, in this budgetary year, which will provide further financial support for foster and kinship carers. The committee, I know, is aware, I discussed it last time I was here, around the range of different consultations that we've undertaken in relation to the bill. One of those has been specifically on the future vision, the future of foster and kinship care, as well as the children's hearing system, moving on from care and the definition of care experience. And all of this has included a huge level of engagement with children and young people with care experience and with relevant stakeholders. So again, I'll be able to go into more detail around some of that once the bill is introduced. And again, back in relation to foster and kinship carers, as well as the Scottish Recommended Allowance, we know that it's not just about financial asks. We know that there's a level of support required there to allow them to do the role that they are doing in caring for our children and young people. So there have been a range, as I say, of engagement sessions and consultation with those carers. I attended one personally myself to listen and to understand some of the issues that they are facing. And going forward, I hope to be able to support kinship and foster carers with that. As I say, we will be launching a new vision for kinship care later on in the year, and there will be further progress in relation to foster care as well. And I believe that that will speak to a lot of the asks and a lot of the concerns that are raised. I hope that answers Ms Dunbar's question.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I, for one, am actually looking forward to the Promise Bill coming forward. If I can move to the Cabinet Secretary. The Scottish Government recently published an impact report on the PEF funding. Can you say a bit about what the Government's assessment has been on how this is helping to close the attainment gap?
So the PEF sampling work has been really pivotal, I think, in looking at clear-cut examples of where PEF has made a difference. I'm sure the member will be aware of examples from our own constituency. Every head teacher I meet with through these events that we've hosted, but also through school visits, is currently asking me, do not take my PEF away, don't take my SAC away. And if you remember, the start of that funding stream, it was always meant to be a 10-year funding stream, and I've discussed this with the committee. So I've given an assurance to committee and to Parliament that the funding will continue beyond to 26-27, which is as far as any government can go. But I think it is important, and I suspect there's probably cross-party consensus for this, that SAC funding is maintained, and within that, of course, there is a PEF budget line, but it has to continue. And one of the things I've been struck by, and I've said this at the head teacher events, is the normalisation of poverty in our schools. The existence of food banks, the existence of clothing banks, the reality now in our schools that PEF funding is being used to meet needs that 10 years ago it didn't have to. So that means that the funding, in terms of how it impacts in our schools, is being used in lots of creatively different ways. So, for example, a primary school in Kirkcaldy that I visited recently was using it to fund a parents group, which on the face of it you might not have considered to be an educational intervention, but was actually about getting mums involved in their children's education, and in so doing was helping to improve attendance, and in so doing was helping to improve attainment. So there is a link between allowing our head teachers the autonomy to use this extra funding for best use, but I think there's also a requirement of the government to reflect on the impact of PEF, and we've done that through the PEF sampling report, which tells us a really positive story in terms of the detailed impact it has had, but also to ask, and what more? Because when schools are responding to a need that historically they might not have had to meet, I think there's a requirement for us to reflect on how we resource our schools post-pandemic, and that's been a point I've been keen to discuss with head teachers through these national events.
Okay, thank you. In the letter that you provided to the committee before today's session, you spoke about additional sports needs, and under the revised statutory guidance, you said that the refreshed code of practice will provide further clarity that a diagnosis is not required in order to secure additional support for learning. Can you maybe just expand on that a bit more?
So I gave evidence to committee on ASN, I think, last September, and at that time I gave the update in relation to the refreshed code of practice. And actually, in listening and responding to the committee, there were a number of changes that we took forward on the back of that. But of course, since that time, we've also had a parliamentary debate where the government has committed to a further review of ASN, how that's delivered. And I've contacted, I think, all parties this week to set up that meeting to look at the scope of that review, mindful that as we do and undertake that review, we're also going to have to consider the code of practice, which is being updated anyway. But I want committee members, as far as possible, and Parliament to feed into that process. The code of practice, though, is fundamental, but when we consider ASN in its totality, we need to be thinking about how children and young people experience support in schools. And one of the things I'm struck by as Cabinet Secretary when I meet with head teachers and classroom assistants and teachers themselves is the variation in relation to how needs are met across the country. So, this has been the subject of debate recently, so it would be remiss of me not to talk to that. There's a programme for government commitment which looks at better data collection. There's also the Audit Scotland report, which I accept provides great challenge to the government, but I also welcome that report because it talks about the need for the transparency of spend in relation to ASN. So the committee will be well aware that we spent over £1 billion last year in relation to ASN, and the budget bakes in an extra £29 million for local authorities to be used for specialist staff. But that transparency and that need for that granularity is really important. There have also been arguments and suggestions for a national stage intervention model. Graham Logan might want to say a little bit more on that. We've been discussing that with head teachers, because they've been clear in their discussions with me that they want to see consistency from local authorities as well in terms of how their staff experience that support and that wraparound care for children and young people. So the code of practice can go some way to responding to that, but I do think the wider ask from Parliament for that review has to take into consideration that work too. But I don't know, Graham, if you want to say more on there.
Yes, thanks very much, Cabinet Secretary. I think, different councils operate staged intervention models, which effectively looks at how they identify the level of need and then the support the young person gets. There's some variation in how that's applied across the country. So, as the Cabinet Secretary says, one idea that's been raised is we look at that again, we look at the national stage intervention. So, for example, if a young person is diagnosed with dyslexia, what should their support be, what entitlements should they have, and looking at that perhaps more consistently across the country. And related to that, as part of the action plan, we're also looking at a national measurement framework to make sure that we are effectively capturing and recognising the achievements of young people with additional needs, and that they're getting the recognition and the parity of esteem that they deserve as well. So there's a number of actions there in the action plan that we hope will make an even greater difference to children and young people.
Okay. Thank you. And I'll finish off, Convener. It would be remiss of me if I didn't ask a question to the Minister for Higher Education and ask him about the college in my area at Nescol. As you're aware, Minister, there was an open letter printed recently from Nescol regarding the changes to the funding approach. They didn't think that it resolved their long-standing issues, because Nescol's got a wide area of campus, as you're aware. They've got campus in Aberdeen, but also they've got one in Fraserburgh, so that is a huge area to cover. I don't think the rural aspect of this has ever been explored. Can you maybe say more about funding and what help, if any, that can be given in this situation?
I think the first thing to say is that the rebaselining exercise that was carried out with the SFC was requested by the sector. It was made very clear to colleges that in doing that there would be winners and losers. I think...
I don't believe I'm saying this, but I can hardly hear you. Could you maybe put your microphone just up a tiny bit, please? Sorry.
Is that better?
Yes.
Oh, apologies. Yeah, I mean, the rebaselining exercise that was carried out was one that was requested by the sector. The SFC were clear that in doing that there would be winners and losers. I think despite that, it was probably predictable that two colleges that were least well served by the exercise took issue with it. Maybe more of a surprise was Nescol's reaction, because Nescol were one of the net winners within that exercise. I think there was a sectoral uplift of 2.6%. I think Nescol received 3.1% circa in totality, including an increase in the teaching funding. That said, I do have a degree of sympathy with their argument. This is a historic, long-standing issue with the Fraserburgh campus, and they're right to say that that element of rurality that they have to deal with is not something that's been recognised. But I hope you would appreciate, and they would appreciate, that all of the anomalies that sit within quite a complex funding system were never going to be addressed in one giant leap. The SFC through the tripartite group have, I think, shown a lot of flexibility and good responsiveness to asks from the sector. And I think that will continue to be the case forward. We are trying to evolve the funding model, as I say, to make it more flexible and agile, to better reflect the outputs from the individual institutions, and where there's an alignment with the needs of the local and national economy. I do think, and I think I said this in response to a question from Mr Rennie in the Chamber a few weeks ago, I do think there's a need, if it's possible for us to do this, to add an element of alignment with the needs of the local and national economy into the funding model. Now, that may well require additional funding, which is going to be difficult to find in the current economic circumstance. But if we could do that, and Nescol met the criteria, then it's something I'd look to address, because I do understand their point about the Fraserburgh campus.
Okay, thank you. I realise I've gone over time slightly, Convener, so I will pass back to you. I may come back in later.
Don't worry about it at all. We'll move now to Pamela King-Clancy.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to Cabinet Secretary, Ministers and officials. I appreciate the opportunity to ask you questions this morning. I want to start with a kind of general question about education and opportunities in Scotland just now. So we know that attainment in schools is declining, the attainment gap is widening. Overall positive destinations are down. More pupils left school with no qualifications than ever before. Fewer pupils left with 1 pass or more at SCQF level 5 and 6. And the gap in attaining a pass or more at those levels is up. Modern apprenticeship starts is down and youth unemployment is up. So can I start by asking the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills, why is education declining and opportunities narrowing?
I believe, Ms Duncan Glancy, we're going to engage in trading statistics this morning. So, if I may, the proportion of pupils achieving the expected level in literacy and numeracy across primary and secondary schools reached its highest level ever in 23-24. The poverty-related attainment gap between young people from the most and the least deprived areas meeting standards in literacy has also reached record levels. The gap also reached in relation to our secondary pupils achieving 3rd level in both literacy and in numeracy has reached record lows too. So I don't accept all of the challenge that Ms Duncan Glancy has put in that regard. She also spoke, Convener, to issues in relation to positive destinations. The percentage of those in a positive destination 3 months after leaving school is 95.7%. That's the 2nd highest since records began. So we can engage in trading statistics this morning if Ms Duncan Glancy wishes to. I'm going to engage in the substantials in relation to my responsibilities. I do not accept all of the challenge the member has put today because we are seeing some improvement in our schools in relation to that gap narrowing. The ACEL data tells us a much more positive story. When we look, for example, at examinations data as well, we are seeing a trajectory post-pandemic of improvement. And as I say, the 2nd highest level on record in relation to positive destinations. So I'm not clear Ms Duncan Glancy and I are going to agree on the statistics that we've traded this morning, but I'm happy to take questions that she might have.
I appreciate that, Cabinet Secretary, but the reality is 35,400 young people between the age of 16 and 24 are not in employment, and that's gone up this year. There are a reduction in people going to colleges. We know that positive destinations, despite the figures that the Cabinet Secretary cites, have gone down. So opportunities for young people on this government's watch are declining. Can the Cabinet Secretary explain why that might be and what she can do to address it?
I again Convener reiterate that the levels in relation to those in a positive destination 3 months after leaving school is 95.7%. That's the 2nd highest level since records began. So again, I'm not sure I can accept the totality of what Ms Duncan Glancy has said. When we look in the round at the
positive destinations, that data is taken from the summary statistics for attainment and initial leaver destinations, number 7, published in 2025. So that data that I've just said.
I know where the data is taken from. It's Scottish Government data.
So you'll know it's gone down then.
It's the 2nd highest since records began.
But it's declining.
I'm sorry. Yes, since last year it has, but in the totality, it is a great improvement since 2007. We have narrowed that attainment gap, particularly in relation to positive destinations. And we know for these young people that going on to a positive destination historically was not always the pathway they would have found after school. Ms Duncan Glancy and I are similar ages. She will know that when we were at school, at the end of S4, there was often a cohort of young people who were encouraged to leave and go elsewhere. Their destinations were not tracked, their pathways were not supported, and they often were not going on to positive destinations. So we have completely transformed that post-education pathway. There is far more support for young people at school. And I think when we consider the statistics in the round, and look, I accept there's a slight movement from last year, but it's still the 2nd highest on record. I'm not necessarily sure I can accept the totality of negativity about our education system. When we look at the ACEL data, we are starting to see improvement as well. So I accept we're moving into an election year, and I potentially expect that this is what will characterise some of our debates in the coming months. But it's not all doom and gloom in Scotland's schools and our education system, and I think we do a disservice to those who work in our schools, our colleges and early years facilities if that's the way in which we choose to characterise them.
Thank you. And on those who work in our schools, we've got shortages in teachers in some secondary subjects and locations, a workforce that is burnt out, and we've seen data as recent as last week on that. Without the non-contact time they've been promised, 44% of staff in schools say they work a day a week for free. Why is it then that the government has ended up with unemployed teachers stuck in temporary or supply contracts?
there are a number of challenges in relation to teacher numbers at the current time. The member will be well aware of that. In secondary, in terms of subject gaps, there's always been a historical challenge in that regard, but we are seeing it present in more subjects, in some subjects in more ways than in others. And more broadly, we also accept there are challenges in terms of primary and impermanence, and I'm sure we'll come on to discuss that in more detail. I've been really clear that through our budget negotiations with COSLA, and we all know, because we regularly debate this in the Chamber, that the government does not employ teachers, local authorities do. So I need to agree with local authorities, with COSLA, a funding approach that will protect teacher numbers and also deliver on the point that Ms Duncan Glancy quite rightly raises, particularly in relation to reducing class contact, which we know will make a difference in terms of alleviating that workload. And the member also talked quite rightly to burnout that the profession is experiencing at the current time. I'm sure actually that some of that in part relates to the issues that Ms Dunbar raised in terms of PEF, because schools are now doing so much more to meet the needs of their children and young people post-pandemic. The expectations on our classroom teachers in particular are now completely different than they might have been prior to 2020. So in terms of workforce planning, of course, the responsibility for local workforce planning rests with local government. Nationally, we do have a responsibility, and we work with local authorities on that every year. But through the work through the Education Assurance Board, and actually through Ms Duncan Glancy's debate that we agreed to not that long ago, and more recently another debate in this space, we've agreed to have that national approach to workforce planning with COSLA at the table. They have to be there as the employer. And the final point I would make in relation to teacher numbers and how you resource this, you know, I put in extra money into the budget. We all have our battles at the Cabinet table over this, but managed to get extra funding for teacher numbers that uprated to £186.5 million to protect teacher numbers, and £29 million of funding to support additional support needs in our schools. And I have to observe, of course, that Ms Duncan Glancy and her party colleagues chose to abstain on the budget. I don't think that was the right call, but the extra funding is there for a purpose. Without that extra funding, I'm not sure how we answer the challenge that Ms Duncan Glancy has put to me today.
And the Cabinet Secretary often talks of inputs such as that, but we still have a situation where teachers can't get jobs. The Cabinet Secretary mentions additional support needs. And does Cabinet Secretary know what the pupil-teacher ratio is for pupils with additional support needs and ASN teachers?
I have the overall PTR of 13.3, but not the ASN figure in front of me just now. The committee, in asking ministers to appear today, did not provide us with that detailed breakdown of all the areas that they wish to cover, so I'm more than happy to write to committee with any of that detail.
Can help. In an FOI that the government has, it's detailed how many ASN teachers there are and how many ASN pupils there are. And that equates to approximately 1 ASN teacher to 208 pupils with additional support needs. Now, that ratio is probably recognised by parents, children and young people across Scotland, and teachers and staff in schools, because they recognise how stretched they are. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary today, what is she going to do to materially make a difference to pupils with additional support needs?
So I think the premise of Ms Duncan Glancy's question, Convener, is that ASN can only be met by an ASN teacher. That's not the case. 95% of pupils, as we know, with identified additional support need, are in mainstream. And classroom teachers in Scotland also have a responsibility to meet the needs of additional support needs. It's why in your teacher training you're provided with support to do that. So I think
Cabinet Secretary, forgive me for talking over you, but the point on classroom teachers, the data that we saw last week from the trade union said that only 1% of classroom teachers say they've got time to support pupils with additional support needs.
OK, well that takes me back to the point I made previously, which is we need to reduce class contact. We do that through providing funding through the budget. If parties can get behind that, we can deliver on it, put the extra teachers that are needed in to allow us to reduce class contact, to create the time for teachers to engage in relation to ASN.
OK, and finally, just on ASN, the government has said that they'll look at accreditation for support staff, but that's been deprioritised for another focus. Can the Cabinet Secretary set out when that will be reprioritised, and when will support staff be a priority for a workforce plan?
It has not been deprioritised. It was part actually of the Butte House Agreement, as Mr Greer I'm sure will want to come in on this point. But look, it's really tricky because I've got 32 councils, bluntly, who often do 32 different things when it comes to education. So getting them all to agree on something is not without challenge, as the committee knows, and we regularly debate these points. Now, there are some local authorities, and I would like to heap praise on my own, which might surprise Mr Rennie, who have an approach to accreditation that essentially supports staff who join the pupil support workforce to become accredited at a certain level. Other local authorities take different approaches. They don't require accreditation. We will look to publish that report in the coming weeks. Mr Greer, I want to put on record my thanks to him for all of his input to this. I'm sure we're about to discuss it in further detail, but it has been a key ask in the profession. I am absolutely committed to delivering on it. I need to get that agreement from local authorities, from COSLA in particular, to how we roll that out nationally.
Okay, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And with the convener's forbearance, I've got a couple of questions for the Minister for Further Education and Higher Education. The Minister said that, and the letter the Cabinet Secretary sent to committee said there would be no reduction as a result of the change in the model for college funding to colleges this year. Kelvin College in my region of Glasgow has seen a net reduction. They're also left wondering why they have been grouped within the family of colleges that they have been. Does the Minister have any? Can the Minister shed any light on the reasons why the decisions have been taken and the impact that they've had on colleges like Kelvin, who are serving a number of areas that have a high level of deprivation and that doesn't seem to have been taken account of in the allocation?
Well, again, as the CABSEC has done, I need to take issue with the statistics that you're quoting. Glasgow Kelvin College, and I have the numbers in front of me, received a 3.15% uplift. They were one of the main beneficiaries of the rebaselining. Of course, some of that was for lecturers' pay, some of that was for pension funding, but their basic uplift, there was a basic uplift of, I think, £170,000 on their credit threshold, so they did receive more money.
They've said, and the Minister's right with that data, it's a 0.82% net increase, £170,000, which, when you take into consideration the other wider obligations they have, they've put to me as a real terms cut. So does the allocation take account of the fact that it is serving areas of multiple deprivation and a large proportion of learners with ASN?
So, because one of the wider challenges they face, Ms Duncan Glancy, is ENICs and an increase that was brought forward by your government in Westminster with insufficient consequentials to allow us to negate that on their behalf. So a lot of the pressures that they face are certainly out with our control. As to the nature of the families that they were put in as part of this process, that was something that was taken forward by the SFC. I'll be happy to ask the SFC to provide a rationale for why Kelvin sits alongside that one. But the colleges in and around Glasgow have had a legitimate, in my view, concern about the way in which they were funded set against others. And this exercise has begun to address this.
And the Minister will be aware that I've written to him about this particular issue, and colleges have raised some concerns about the decision. So I'd look forward to hearing back from the SFC through the Minister on how those decisions have been reached. And finally, Minister, do you recognise that colleges in Scotland are the only public sector part of the public sector where there has been a significant decrease in staff? And what impact does the Minister think that will have on skills going forward?
Well, there has been, over a period of time, a decrease in staff. I recognise that. Colleges have been evolving their offering because they need to respond to the needs of the economy. But there's an interesting element to this, which is that sometimes staff numbers have gone down because courses have been reduced. But I can think of at least one college that I know of where the number of courses were reduced because of demand, but the number of students attending that college have gone up, and that is about responding to needs. So no one ever wants to see job losses on a scale, but we are in a period of evolution in the college sector, as in other sectors, and I am optimistic about where this will end up in terms of the future of the colleges as they evolve that offer and they align it better to the needs of the local and national economy and the needs of learners.
That period of evolution has been 28% reduction since 2007, so that's a significant reduction and quite a long period of evolution. And my final question to the Minister for Children and Young People, can the Minister set out when the transition strategy will be published?
Absolutely. So, as the member is aware, we have committed to introducing Scotland's first national transitions to adult strategy to ensure that there's a joined-up approach to ensure that young disabled people who are transitioning into adulthood get the support that they require. I believe I wrote to Ms Duncan Glancy on this recently. The strategy will be published before summer recess.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. And we move to Willie Rennie.
Thank you, Convener. This is to the Cabinet Secretary. It's about, following on from Pam Duncan Glancy, about temporary teachers and short-term contracts. I'm inundated with concerns by whole hosts of teachers who have changed career, wanted to engage in primary education to shape young minds, but they are limping from one temporary contract to the next, sometimes only gathering just a few days' work every month. And they can't claim any benefits because they're receiving some financial income through their work. But your workforce planning group has estimated that there's 950 extra primary teachers than there are jobs. How many? You've also said that you would encourage some of them to move into secondary education or into ASN. How many jobs are available in ASN for them?
Well, I thank Mr Rennie for his question. I obviously don't have that detail in front of me. I'd need to go on My Job Scotland and collect it. But in terms of ASN, important to recognise that there are many staff employed just now in relation to the PEF funding that I spoke to Ms Dunbar about earlier. The wider issue that Mr Rennie raises, and he's written to me about this in constituency correspondence, does vary by local authority area. In fact, in terms of teaching recruitment practices, this was one of the issues I first raised when I was first elected back in 2016, because we've got 32 different approaches to it, and I don't think that's great to supporting our teaching profession. One of the points to come out of the debate we held a couple of weeks ago now was a Labour amendment, and there's a line in it which talks about having a national supply list. I'm all for supporting that, and we've agreed with the Labour amendment. But we now need COSLA to work with us on how that works and is delivered in practice. And at local authority level, we see too much inconsistency in terms of the use of contracts. We also see a huge over-reliance on probation. So we shouldn't divorce the issues in relation to permanency and short-term contracts with a centrally funded probationer scheme that I've committed to reviewing, which is essentially seeing, to my mind, too much of a churn in the system, particularly in primary school. That's not good for our early years teachers, it's not good for supporting them, it's also not good for retention. So we need to work with local authorities to encourage them to provide permanent contracts. The budget settlement has been part of that. The other part that I alluded to in relation to linking the pupil equity point is that those funding streams that the now First Minister committed to when he was Cabinet Secretary were 4-year-long funding streams to give local authorities clear sight of the funding that was coming so that they could create permanent or longer-term posts, to Mr Rennie's point. But I think in its totality, there are real challenges in terms of our workforce just now. That issue is not unique to Scotland. The United Nations published a report on this actually last year, which is really helpful, talking about the precarity of employment across the education landscape in many different countries, and across the UK we are seeing it. And part of that has also been driven by wages. Now, I think it was right that we awarded the good pay rises that we have to the profession, but with that, of course, it means that local authorities are now having to look at other budget lines. So we need to, in the round, I think, re-evaluate how we fund the totality of the teaching workforce, which was another point to come out of the debate we held the other week.
So, let me take you back. You had offered up to those 950, maybe more, teachers who can't find a permanent contract or even find any work. You offered up the additional support needs option. You've not answered the question about how many jobs there are, because you don't clearly know. But secondly, how many have taken up that offer? Because if this is a real offer, teachers want to know how many of them are actually going to be able to pursue this route successfully and find some kind of work. So can you give us some clarity about how many jobs and how many have applied?
So the roles and responsibilities here are important. Mr Rennie knows that the local authority is the employer. What we have done through the budget agreement, which was made in good faith, was to perfect... Well, I hear Mr Rennie speaking of me. If he may allow me to complete my point. There was extra funding provided for in the budget There was also extra funding for additional support needs that was ring-fenced for specialist staff provision to local authorities. It is in their gift how that is deployed, not mine as Cabinet Secretary. If Mr Rennie now wishes the government to employ these teachers, well, I'm interested to hear the point expanded, because I often hear this in the chamber. And then the second point relates to primary teachers, for example, moving into secondary. We're working with the GTCS on that exact point. We're also looking at creative ways in which we might be able to use professional learning to support some of this work. I met with School Leaders Scotland last week, who are very amenable to this. I have to say, the issue in relation to primary teachers, for example, working in secondary is not without debate in Scottish education, and some of our professional associations have differing views on this. I am a secondary specialist to trade. Mr Rennie will know this. I don't think there's any support for primary staff being involved in the delivery of national qualifications, quite rightly, and the GTCS would certainly have something to say on that. But there is a role for us to look again at the role of primary teachers, I think, in early years of secondary. I know that a number of head teachers just now are using primary school teachers in the delivery of the broad general education. So it is happening across the country, and it's about how we work with our professional associations to give them the support to that end. So I can come back to Mr Rennie on the substantive points in relation to the numbers, but I also again have to reflect that in advance of committee today, we were not provided with the detail of what the committee wanted to consider. So if Mr Rennie wants me to obtain that from local authorities who employ our ASN staff, I'm more than happy to write to the committee with that detail.
I mean, teachers bluntly are pretty angry. They are lurching from one contract to the next. They were promised a career, and you produced too many primary school teachers because you were unable to match supply with demand. And that was your responsibility through the initial teacher education institutions. And that is what they're furious about. And you've offered up in a throwaway comment about additional support needs option, when you don't know how many jobs there are and you don't know even how many have applied for it. That's why they're angry. They think they're being treated with disrespect. And I agree with them, because I think it's unacceptable that they're being left in this position. It's also not good for them in the class either. And I'm sorry to be so angry about this, but I see them, and I hope you see them every day, about just how angry they are. So at the end of this process, let's say next year at this time, the figure today was 950. How many surplus primary school teachers will we have next year?
Well, to the substantive point, I don't want there to be surplus primary teachers. I
No,
would like
how
them
many
all to
do you
be
think
employment.
there will be? Do you think there'll be any?
Mr Rennie's asking me to make a guess about something that will happen in the future. That's not my responsibility. But what
See,
is my
this is what
responsibility?
they're angry about.
Well, I'm hearing Mr Rennie talk over me, if he may. I hear what he is saying. I am very well aware of the challenge, because it is put to me regularly. But the issue I face as Cabinet Secretary is one we will keep coming back to this committee, which is that the government does not employ our teachers. Every Education Secretary who has come before me has faced the same challenge with local government in relation to how we can get them to commit to protecting teacher numbers, because we know that's what makes a difference in our classrooms. Now, I think it is worthwhile recounting that since 2014, I think the number of permanent posts has remained static at around 80%. We've also seen an increase in relation to the number of teachers in Scotland's schools by 2,500. That's because we're protecting funding for teacher numbers. Had we not done that, in the 2022 budget proposal from COSLA at that time, they were proposing staff reductions of up to 8,000 teachers. That's not acceptable. So I hear from Mr Rennie the anger from the profession. I accept that. I've also taken action. I would just like to reflect that for the 25-26 academic year, the ITE intakes for primary school teaching programmes have been reduced by 10% to respond to that exact criticism and that exact point. But it is not good enough for us to have a continued debate about government not acting when government cannot employ. So what is the answer to Mr Rennie's point? I think we have to work with local authorities. The ECAB work, which had already started through the Education Assurance Board, is part of that. The budget agreement, which has been made in good faith, absolutely has to be about not throwaway comments, but cold hard cash being put into the system to employ ASN teachers or ASN specialists or speech and language therapists or educational psychologists or classroom teachers to make the difference. I protected that funding at national level. I now expect local authorities to deliver on it locally, as they are elected to do, of course.
Can I move on to the Higher Education Minister? The Cosford College. The Minister will recall that during the budget negotiations we secured £1.4 million for Cosford College through in Shinnon in Renfrewshire, and it's for adults with particular needs. At that point we were going through, there was a requirement for an evaluation process before that was continued for a further 2 years. Can the Minister give us an update on that?
Yeah, I think just to be clear, I think the work that we did jointly to try and progress this was that it would be the Cosford model or something based on the learning that came from that evaluation. That evaluation commenced in March. I'm pleased to say it's a very timely question on Mr Rennie's part because we've received the initial feedback on the evaluation within the last few days. I think it would be fair to say, I'm not going to sit here and commit absolutely to the way forward on this, but if I say to him that the report has reached what you would describe as broadly positive conclusions as to the impact of the Cosford model, with some suggestions for improvements in relation to staffing and to processes and approach, we are taking that away just now and looking at what that means in practice. I would be optimistic we will have something positive to say about this fairly quickly, because it does need to happen fairly quickly, because we are, there's a lot of uncertainty around this. But I think the exercise that we've carried out in terms of, and this should have happened previously, I accept that, a proper assessment of the outcomes of this, what worked well, what didn't work so well, what could we learn from it, it has now been done. And as I say, I would hope to be able to say something shortly, more definitively.
Well, I thank the Cabinet, the Minister for that. I mean, Capability Scotland, the staff, the students, the families will be pleased that we're able to make some positive progress on this. I've visited the place myself. I've seen, I think, from my layman's perspective, what I think is a good facility. So I hope we're able to move quite swiftly on this. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. Cabinet Secretary, can I just ask to follow on from Willie Rennie's original questions? When did you last meet with Scottish Teachers for Permanence?
I think I'm scheduled to meet with them shortly. Convener, you raised this matter with me in the Chamber. I'm scheduled to meet with them in the coming weeks, I think, before the end of term.
Because it was the 28th of November and they hadn't heard, so I'm encouraged that is now in the diary. But they were also under the belief that you would also convene a meeting between them and COSLA and yourself. Has that also happened, or will that happen?
I will engage with them at the next meeting, but can I just say, Convener, in relation to workforce and how we engage with the profession, the route obviously for me as Cabinet Secretary is via the professional associations who I meet with regularly, but I have met with this new group who are not affiliated to the trade unions, as I understand it, and I look forward to meeting them soon.
Okay, thank you very much. And we move to George Adam.
Thank you, Convener. Convener, before I ask my questions, I'd just like to say a few words with regards to the situation of you convening this from a tropical island to the other side of the world.
Please do carry on, Mr Adam.
For the record, I'm not happy with the idea. I find this meeting farcical, the fact that you'd even think that you could actually do that from online from the other side of the world. And to be fair, it's the best behaved you've been in the past couple of weeks, so perhaps being online suits you and not actually meeting people in person is maybe not your kind of best way forward. But the aggressive manner and the lack of respect that you've shown to people who have come to the committee in the past has just actually made this Parliament look bad. And I want to put that on the record because we have tried on numerous occasions to talk to you, take you aside and ask you to do the right thing, but you continue with your continued behaviour. And quite frankly, I think it makes you look small and pathetic. But on that point, I will ask my question of the Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, it's actually about the UK Child Poverty Action Group. I've recently spoken about the increasing cost of the school day, and it's something we've heard ongoing for some time now. I've also heard that Keir Starmer is seeking to copy some of the good ideas that the Scottish Government have had about free school meals. So I wondered if you could maybe specifically tell me where the Scottish Government is with their idea to help reduce the cost of the school day, because obviously in a cost of living crisis, parents and families will be finding this an extra burden for them.
I thank Mr Adam for his question. There are a range of different actions that we're taking to reduce the cost of the school day, not least in terms of reducing the cost of school trips has been funded provided to local authorities to that end. There's also the work, I think Mr Adam alluded to there, in terms of free school meal provision. Pupil equity funding, as we know, and as I think I responded to Jackie Dunbar previously, is being used in many different schools to help reduce the cost of the school day. And I suppose the substantive part of Mr Adams' question leans back to the point I was making to Ms Dunbar earlier, which is that schools are now filling a gap which didn't used to exist. And because of the erosion of the welfare state in certain areas, schools have stepped up to the mark where arguably they should not have had to. That has impacted on how they engage with PEF and how they engage with the wider school community. They've done that because they care about their children and young people. But my argument would be they shouldn't have to. So there are a range of different measures that we are taking forward in relation to reducing the cost of the school day. And of course, we know that the funding being provided for free school meals is saving families up to £450 per child per year, making a real difference. There's also funding in the budget for the rollout of the Bright Start breakfast funding, which has been welcomed. And we know that across Scotland, about half of all schools have some delivery of breakfast provision. Many schools use their PEF funding to meet that need. So there's not a universal structure to how this is met across the country, as I think we've explored with Mr Rennie and others. We have variation with local authorities in terms of how they deliver this, but the funding is being provided by the government to reduce the cost of the school day in many different ways, on free school meals, on school trips, and more broadly through how we provide that funding in terms of pupil equity.
It's quite interesting because all my time in the committee, and I think we've discussed this before, Cabinet Secretary, the use of PEF funding seems to be where there are schools where the leadership's there, they can see the issue and they start dealing with it. It's not what PEF was originally meant to be doing, but it is filling that gap, and it just shows you the situation that many schools find themselves in because of the decisions of the UK government. So my argument would be, surely we should be asking the UK government to actually look at some of their issues so that we can use that PEF funding for the actual manner and what it's meant to be used for, instead of trying to paper up the cracks of a failing UK government.
Well, I would agree with the sentiment behind Mr Adams' question. I've not seen yet if there's going to be an announcement today, for example, on lifting the two-child cap, but we know that that would alleviate child poverty at the stroke of a pen. So there's lots of actions that the UK government could take. I hope that we hear more on that point today. Unless both of our governments are working in unison to tackle child poverty, it is not going to work. We know the Scottish Child Payment has been a game changer in ensuring that Scotland's child poverty levels stay lower than in other parts of the United Kingdom. But we need to see concerted effort across these islands working with the UK government. So I really do hope that we see more progress from the UK government to that end today.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Moving on to the Minister for Children and Young People and the Promise. The Minister will be aware that both of us were at the Promise Oversight Board event recently that I hosted in the Parliament, and about keeping the promise. And one of the big issues discussed was the need for cross-government approach again. It's funny saying this question in the back of what the Cabinet Secretary just said to us there. So I wonder if the Minister can say a bit more about the progress in that space. Where are we at with working with the UK government to see where we can work together to make that difference?
Well, I think Mr Adams raises a really important point, and I think I've said a lot in terms of delivery of the promise. We will not deliver the promise in isolation. It is going to take, a joint approach between national government, indeed UK government, working with UK government colleagues, local government and our third sector. And I think there's a number of different approaches that we're taking to ensure that we are having that joint approach. So, for example, at government level, we continue to have the Cabinet Subcommittee in the Promise, which includes some of my ministerial colleagues with a relevant interest to make sure that we are all aware, or everyone is aware, of actions being taken within their own remits. I most recently met with the Minister for Housing, Paul McLennan, to discuss issues around housing in relation to delivering the Promise. And I think in relation to local authorities, the Promise Progress Framework is going to be absolutely instrumental in understanding how we're keeping the promise, and I really do welcome the Oversight Board's recognition of the role of that. That framework has been developed by COSLA, the Scottish Government and the Promise Scotland, and it has had input from a range of key stakeholders, including Who Cares, Celsius, a number of different organisations. And I think, back to my first point, this is the first step in understanding progress in relation to what is being delivered by who and how we are working together to deliver on those aims. So I think there'll be a number of actions that we can take from that, and a range of learning. In relation to the UK Government, I have met with UK Government colleagues as well to discuss different aspects of the promise. Obviously, we are on quite separate journeys, but I think it's very important in relation to a number of approaches that are being taken at UK Government level that we are discussing this, that we're talking and that we're aware of the different areas, because in relation to, for example, secure care or cross-border placements and things like that, there is a relevancy there in terms of making sure that we are talking to each other. And I would just draw finally on the progress and I think the success of the whole family wellbeing funding, which is, as Mr Adam will be aware, is providing funding to CSPPs and local areas to really encourage that joined up approach, make sure that local authorities are working with relevant partners, key stakeholders. Actually, sometimes just departments and local authorities speaking to each other can be a bit of a barrier sometimes. So the whole family wellbeing has really helped to embed and kind of transform those approaches, and I think that that's really key. So I actually thank Mr Adam for that question, because I think it's really important to put on record the importance of having that joined up approach in terms of delivering on the promise.
Yeah, Minister, one of the points you bring up about local government, you and I both come from almost the exact same background in local government, where we come from the same place. And you know that in issues like this and projects like this, it's the leadership at a local level that makes a difference, and it's the ownership. And one of the things as a committee we've seen is the fact that we come in and some councils are very proactive. The whole idea of the promise goes through the very ethos of the work they do, and others less so. And there can be arguments made between the size of councils. Smaller councils can react a lot quicker than a larger council, but it's the whole kind of culture change. How do you see how we're getting on with making sure that local councils actually take that culture change on board and actually kind of develop this further and make it part of their ongoing work, their day-to-day business?
So again, I think that's a really important point, and I don't want to do local authorities a disservice. I think there are difficulties, and as Mr Adam states, there are challenges and different demographics in relation to our range of 32 local authorities. So there are different approaches being taken. I think that some local authorities are further forward in some areas, and I think and maybe others are further forward in different areas. And I think that's why it's so important in relation to the Promise Progress framework that we are kind of able to track that progress. What I would also say is, and again, this is sort of something that I tend to labour on, the importance of sharing best practice. So I've been to a number of conferences and different events of recent years where local authorities are coming together, again, with third sector partners and government to understand what each other are doing, to understand the different approaches that are being taken. And I think just having those opportunities to come together, to engage and to understand the different approaches that are being taken is extremely important. And I think that that in itself is making really good progress. But as I say, in relation to your original point, there are a number of sort of ways to track the delivery of the promise. And I think that we are making good progress in kind of ensuring that transformational change and those different approaches at local authority level.
Okay, thank you, Minister. And again, all roads lead to Paisley, as we know, Minister. And last Friday, the government announced it's expanding the extra time scheme with the SFA. And I mention this mainly because the CABSEC for Social Justice announced this with St Mirren Charitable Foundation, with the Minister will know does a great work in both our constituencies. So can you say a bit about the programme, what the programme will do and how this will make a difference?
Absolutely, and I am very keen on the SFA programme. I've actually been out to visit one of the projects, and it is fantastic in terms of what it's delivering, in terms of providing that before school, after school and holiday activity clubs to targeted primary school children from those low-income families. Now, as Mr Adam rightly says, that announcement was made last Friday. We're increasing our investment to £5.5 million, and that's going to take us from 31 clubs to 53 clubs, and ensuring that that is reaching children and young people across Scotland. I think the programme is very important in understanding and sort of building towards that future system of school-age childcare, because, you know, as we're very aware, different families have different needs, different children have different needs, and it's not quite a one-size-fits-all approach. So I think this is absolutely instrumental in sort of working towards that future system. We have had a recent annual impact report which has reported on improved outcomes for children, particularly those on low incomes, and that is part of one of 2 publications. There will be a more detailed process evaluation report which will be published soon. And this is going to explore some of the themes that came out of that first report in relation to tackling child poverty, school attendance and improved outcomes for children. So I would really encourage any members who haven't visited one of the projects to do so, because it is fantastic. And when I was speaking to the children and young people who were attending, they were having a fantastic time. So it's a very, very positive move.
Well, it's an example of ongoing projects that I, for one, have been very supportive in all my time here and as a councillor previously. Because if you look at teams like St Mirren and St Mirren Charitable Foundation and the great work the Chief Executive, Gail Brannigan, does in our area, you know, you can actually see how our national game can make a difference in young people's lives and actually can be used. And is it not the case, Minister, that possibly we should look to our national sport to actually maybe deliver, instead of talking about the negatives about our national game in Parliament, maybe talk about the good work they're doing? I remember there was a chairman of St Mirren years ago said, when are you going to second social workers to St Mirren? And it seemed a silly idea, but the more you thought about them going in with a St Mirren polo shirt instead of Renfrewshire Council kind of logo on their back, makes a big difference to the attitude of the people they're dealing with. It almost takes a third sector kind of ideal. So on that, do you not think there's more scope we could develop this further? It's a very long-winded way for me to ask, could we look at this and develop this further?
I mean, I think so, and I think the fact that we have extended and we've increased the investment in this programme proves that, you know, there are positive outcomes coming from it, and it's something that could be extended further. And as I've alluded to, I think it's really key in terms of understanding and looking towards that kind of future system. So I absolutely agree with Mr Adams' point, yes.
Well, thank you. And finally, a question of the Minister for Higher Education and Further Education. I've maybe got the advantage of sitting here in sunny Paisley, watching various computers around here and seeing everything that's going on at the moment. And I've just seen that there's been talk from the UK government of a cut of the Turing scheme, which is cut from 110 million to £78 million. Now, we've been hearing how wonderful this scheme is and how it's going to make a difference and be almost like a better version of Erasmus Plus. What is the cabinet? The minister's attitude to this cut? I've literally just seen the headline just come in right there, so I'm a bit concerned about this.
Yeah, so am I. I met with the UK government on Monday with Baroness Smith. I very much appreciated the engagement. I said 2 things to her about this. Firstly, that I understood that difficult decisions had to be made in government in challenging financial circumstances, but this was deeply disappointing and concerning. As you've alluded to, Mr Adam, this has been a welcome scheme. It's been no replacement for Erasmus Plus. It was never going to be, but it has been incredibly important and oversubscribed. The reduction that has been, you tell me, has been announced. I was expecting it today. I wasn't sure it was this early in the day. Yes, it will have be a cause of significant concern, particularly for our universities and colleges.
Yeah, and how does it directly affect yourself, Minister, and us here in Scotland?
Well, I mean, Scotland's share of the Turing funding has come down over the 3 years that it's been in operation. And the demand from Scottish institutions and organisations has gone up. You'll forgive me, I need to digest this in totality and have conversations with those who will be impacted. I'm sure that will happen over the next few days, but it is a significant setback. There is no doubt about that.
No, I'm sorry, Minister, for putting you in the place, and I've literally just seen it flash up. I'm a sad individual that has alerts of anything to do with my committees, and it just literally came up there, and it was one of the things I thought, while I should have you here ask the question, because surely Scottish pupils will kind of have difficulty with this happening to as well, because it will cut their opportunity for them as well.
Well, my understanding is that, notwithstanding the cut, the UK Government wants to retain a focus on the disadvantaged. What that will mean in reality, we've yet to see. I think one of the worries that this will create for particularly the university sector is what it says about the commitment to returning to Erasmus+. So very welcome indications from the UK Government a couple of weeks ago that it was going to be actively exploring that with the EU, and I know there's an appetite within the EU to welcome the UK back into Erasmus+. My understanding is that we are only at the stage currently of essentially having talks about what the talks would look like. But I think this announcement will cause concern about those who were excited at the prospect of a return to Erasmus Plus in some form, because Erasmus Plus was a costly scheme, one might argue. That was certainly a view that was held. And around the time that the UK withdrew from the EU, the budget doubled. So there's obviously a financial aspect to the negotiations that will take place around the return to Erasmus+. So it won't encourage a view that things are looking hopeful in that regard, but I hope I'm proved wrong.
Okay, thank you. That's all, Convener.
Thank you. Just before I move to Pam Duncan-Glancy, who'd like to come in with a supplementary, Cabinet Secretary, can I go back to Mr Adams' first question about the cost of the school day and free school meals? Is there anything you'd like to elaborate on the government-initiated question that you've answered this morning?
Thank you, Convener. Just to check, that government-inspired question has now published.
It has been published, yeah.
Yes, so there are 8 local authorities that are going to be funded through the Test of Change work. That's essentially for us to look at how we might be able to scale up in the future delivery of free school meals. They all have varying different needs across the country, and I think the GIQ sets out in a bit more detail, but it of course looks at secondary schools in particular.
I suppose my question is, and I'm very pleased to see my own local authority of Murray being one of the 8 that have been selected. There were 17 applicants. What happens to the local authorities who wanted to be part of this scheme but were not selected? What's the feedback to them, and what can they do going forward while the study continues?
I may defer to officials in that regard, Convener. We were oversubscribed, I think it's fair to say, in relation to bids from local authorities who are keen to upscale their delivery of free school meals. And I may pass to Graham Logan on this point. We want to engage with those other local authorities, though, to your wider point on how we can support them, because we want to encourage all local authorities to look at a wider rollout of free school meals more broadly. But Graham, are you able to say more on engagement?
Thanks, Ms Gores. Thank you, Convener. Yeah, I think there was a process, obviously, engaging with COSLA to select local authorities. We weren't sure how much interest there would be. Obviously, this was part of the budget agreement to pilot for children in receipt of the Scottish Child Payment in secondary schools. So I think beyond those 8 local authorities, Convener, what we'll be looking to do is to share the learning, so that in the event of any further rollout, given the government is ultimately committed to further rollouts when finance is available of free school meals, we'd be looking to work with COSLA and all interested local authorities to share the learning on areas like uptake, engagement with young people and so on as well. But at this stage, that funding is for the 8 local authorities identified today.
And since you've named the 8 local authorities that were successful, will you be publishing those who applied but were not successful? And is there any questions as to why a local authority wouldn't want to be part of this?
I think it's difficult to say why local authority might not want to be part of it. We would want them all to be engaged to some extent. But of course, decisions need to be made because there was a limited level of funding available through the budget negotiation process. But we need to engage with COSLA, I think, in the next steps in terms of those local authorities that were not successful. And more broadly, I think, to learn lessons. This is a pilot, though, so it is an opportunity for us to learn lessons about how we might be able to scale this up in the future at national level.
I think my request for the details of those who applied that weren't successful was so members can know whether they should be approaching their local authority to ask, did you not apply and why did you not apply? It might be helpful for some members.
If I could take further advice from officials on that, I don't have an objection to sharing that detail with the committee. I can provide that in written form following today's session.
Okay, thank you. I'll move to Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Convener. I just want to build on some of George Adams' question around the SFA, if I may, with the Minister for Children and Young People. There's some really good examples of that programme in Glasgow. One of the issues that's been brought to my attention, though, is that some childcare providers have been providing childcare for a long time before the SFA, at a reduced rate for families, and now the SFA is obviously providing another opportunity which is free, which is entirely useful and helpful for a lot of those families. How does the Minister see both of those parts of the system working together so as not to displace each other, and what sort of obligations are being placed on the SFA programme that are similar to those that are placed on other early years or childcare providers to ensure child protection, safeguarding, etc.?
Okay, I'll perhaps bring Andrew in a second to speak to some of the obligations, but I think this is something that I have heard about frequently, not just in Glasgow. I actually know the specific issue that Ms Duncan Glancy raises with me, but I know that this is a problem from, or concerns have been raised from across the school-age childcare sector around this. And I would say that moving forward we are doing some work around the regulation of school-age childcare and trying to perhaps take a more balanced approach to allow a system where both of those sort of alternate models can work together, because we don't want a situation where people are displaced. As I was clear to Mr Adam, we want to ensure that the school-age childcare systems that we have in place just now are benefiting us in terms of the learning that we're taking from that, but most importantly are providing good experiences for children and young people and supporting families with workforce. So I think in terms of going forward, that is something that I'm actively involved in right now, in terms of looking at the regulation and looking if there are areas that we can move in terms of striking that more balanced approach. Could I perhaps bring Andrew in to elaborate?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that's the key point Mr Ernst has made there. We've got about 20 projects within the school-age childcare programme overall, and that reflects the fact there's a real mixed model of delivery and provision at the moment. So in terms of setting out the future vision around school-age childcare, we need to understand a range of elements around that, including regulation. So we're working with the Care Inspectorate to take that piece of work forward. I think the combination of the work stream around regulation and the evaluation that Mr Innes mentioned earlier around the impact of not just the extra time programme but other aspects of the school-age programme will enable us then to determine how to take forward that overall model of provision going forward, because we are aware there are some issues there.
Can I just check then, because the organisations who might feel that they've been operating in this space for a long time do have quite a bit of regulation around them, but perhaps the newer system doesn't. What direction is it likely to go in?
I probably can't go into the detail right now, because in terms of, I think Ms Duncan Glancy would agree that the safeguarding of the children is the most important, but I do hear what the member is saying around those who have been around for a long time do face perhaps quite a bit of regulation. So I am looking at the legislation and different approaches that we could take to try to strike that more balanced approach. I probably can't give any more detail on that just now, but I am more than happy to share that with the committee once I've got a little bit more to say around that. But just to really reassure her that that is something that I have heard directly from school-age childcare providers. I've been out on a range, a number of visits to school-age childcare, and it's something that I'm actively working on.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, I think that's probably an appropriate point for everyone to take a comfort break, so I will suspend the meeting until 10:45. Thank you. Okay, welcome back everyone. We now continue our session with the Cabinet Secretary and Ministers, and we move to John Mason.
Thank you very much, Convener. Maybe first of all I could just touch on one or two issues that have been raised already. Mainstreaming and ASN was one of these, and I think, if I got the impression from, I think it was Mr Logan was answering that point about a bit of inconsistency across the country, because I get quite a number of constituents coming to me with children with additional support needs who feel that because they're in Glasgow, they have to have a much greater need in order to get into a special school, whereas they feel that if they were in a surrounding authority, then they would more easily get into a special needs school. And I just wonder if that is your feeling, or what, if you have any thoughts on that.
So I might bring in Mr Logan, because Mr Mason mentioned him after this, but I think to the member's point, the variance we see across the country exists in relation to ASN, exists in relation to Mr Rennie's point on teacher contracts, exists across our educational landscape, has been a feature of our educational landscape, you might argue, for many, many decades. And that's what happens when you've got 32 councils doing sometimes 32 different things. So I think that's not good all the time for parents and for children, particularly children with an identified additional support need. They need consistency. And there is a feeling from parents groups in particular that support might look different in different local authorities and might as a result be better. And I don't think that that's fair. So the revised code of practice that I think Ms Dunbar asked about earlier on is about giving that clearer message in terms of consistency. So, for example, it will look to consider further clarity on the point that I think has been addressed previously, that you do not need a diagnosis to obtain support. It will also give further clarity on the reasons for the decision around placing requests that fall underneath the 2004 Act, which I think is the point Mr Mason has raised. It's also going to strengthen some of the transitions chapter to reflect some of those concerns about ASN pupils moving from primary into secondary. And it will also look at clarity on the relationship between coordinated support plans and other children and young people's plans, with a staged intervention model, which I think, again, was the point that we got to with Ms Dunbar earlier as to whether or not you would have a national staged intervention model. Now, that would be quite a radical departure from where we are currently, but I think given the concerns that Parliament has raised and that we have debated in recent times, it is important that the Government reflects that and responds to it accordingly, and so we can consider all this in the round when we agree on the scope for that ASN review that Parliament has committed to. I don't know, Graham, if you want to say anything further in relation to consistency.
Yeah, thanks, Cabinet Secretary. I think that covers it. I think Mr Mason's point, as you said, was largely about placing requests into specialist provision, and I think it would be worth also highlighting that there has been sort of many innovations locally to look at how individual needs are met, for example, through nurture spaces, specialist classes and units within mainstream schools as well, and the use of technologies as alternatives to specialist provision and to meet needs. And as you say, Cabinet Secretary, I think the Code of Practice will look at further clarity on the reasons for the decisions around placing requests as well. And of course there will be a public consultation exercise on that so that we can get a range of views before that Code of Practice is finalised.
Thank you very much. Another topic that's been mentioned already is teachers not being able to get permanent jobs. And again, my feeling is that in a city like Glasgow or other cities where teachers are being trained, once they've had their training, they're reluctant to perhaps leave the city for good reasons. They may have built up friends and family and all the rest of it. But then I think I saw in the media this week that Papa Westray has struggled for 6 years to get a teacher for their school. And so it does seem there's a bit of an urban-rural split. And I wonder if you agree that that is the case. And how can we encourage younger teachers, probably once they've trained, not to stay in the city, but to move into rural areas?
So, in relation to the case I think Mr Mason raised, we did take this issue up with Orkney Islands Council directly, and they are very clear that's not the case, and it was actually in relation to the movement of point 1 of management time, as I understand it from officials, so I'm not necessarily sure that's accurate. But the wider point Mr Mason raises is live. I did my teacher training in Glasgow many years ago, and I tick the box, as people will be fed up of hearing. But that preference waiver scheme that we operate, which offers £8,000, I think, to secondary, £6,000 to primary as a golden handshake, is not being taken up in the way it was before the pandemic. I think part of the challenge here is that during the pandemic, we gave probationer teachers a job in their local authority. And I think that has fed into a belief that there will be a job at the end in that local authority. And that has never been the case. It's always been a competitive marketplace. I remember what it was like for me many, many years ago, having to apply to a multitude of local authorities across the country and having to move as well. I do accept Mr Mason's point that moving for some people is much easier than for others. If you're single, if you don't have family and you have the money bluntly to do it, you can move. But there are other incentives I think we need to build in working with local authorities to encourage people to move to different parts of the country. We have real challenges in Aberdeenshire at the moment and in Highland Council. And I've addressed this directly with both of these local authorities. In the past, we've seen local authorities like Aberdeenshire work with us on part funding, for example, programmes that will encourage people to resettle. There is additional funding actually available for people who work in rural schools as well. But in the round of reviewing the probationer scheme, we will also have to consider the preference waiver scheme, which we know is not as popular as it arguably should be, to fill the gaps that we accept exist in some of the rural and remote locations that Mr Mason has spoken to.
Thank you for that as well. Another point that's already been raised is the Promise Bill, and I accept that we can't say exactly what's in it, but I did meet with Who Cares Scotland last week, and their big ask is the right to independent advocacy. Is the Minister able to say anything on that score?
I can tell Mr Mason that that has been considered in terms of introduction of the bill, but I cannot disclose the contents of the bill at the moment.
Yeah. Okay, well,
but I am aware of the calls
right.
from Who Cares and from other care-experienced, either children, young people or organisations involved, and I will be happy to discuss the contents of the bill.
That's fine, as long as it's on the Minister's wavelength or whatever, because the convener and I met a group from care-experienced young people from Wales just the other week, and it appeared to be that they had already had the right to independent advocacy. I'm not sure if that's exactly comparable with the Scottish situation, but that's what they were telling us. So it's going to be interesting when we see the actual bill. Right, moving on to another sector. Now, I realise Liz Smith is here today and may want to raise about her bill, but I just wanted to raise it myself. The committee's been copied into a certain amount of correspondence between the Minister and Liz Smith about her residential outdoor education bill. And I mean, I think the committee was very enthusiastic about the idea of residential outdoor education, but for me, the cost was the big issue. And I just wondered if we could forget about the bill and put some money into a pot which would top up the existing system. And I just wonder if that is an option, because when I read this last letter of the 10th of June, I think it is, from Ms Donanis, it talks about the member having to engage with COSLA and the trade unions, and I mean, that just seems like an impossible barrier to me.
Thanks, Mr Mason. So we discussed the bill at length last time I was at committee, and I am aware Ms Smith is here and may want to discuss this herself during her own questioning. I think I've been quite clear around my own or the government's position around our support for outdoor education in all its forms, support of the principles in relation to outdoor education, but very clear concerns around not just affordability, the equity of provision, also the workforce implications. Now, I've been having very productive conversations with Ms Smith, both in person and via correspondence, but in terms of both how we could, how Ms Smith could amend the bill going forward to combat some of the concerns that have been raised by both the committee and the government. However, I am also looking at non-legislative options as well that I have been discussing with members, and I'm more than happy to discuss those with Mr Mason at another out of committee time.
Well, I suppose at the moment I was just looking for an assurance that things are moving forward, because it seemed to have got a little bit stuck at one point. But
as I say, I think there has been very productive conversations ongoing with the member around the bill, and I will be arranging another meeting with Ms Smith, as long as she is happy with that, prior to the summer recess. So I can assure the member that we have been working at pace, because I'm very aware that there is a large period of recess where we might be more limited in what we can do. So I have been trying to be as proactive in this space as possible prior to that.
Okay, thank you for that. And just a much more general question, the whole area about young people going into careers. And I mean, I still go into schools and ask, how many girls are thinking about engineering, and it's very few, or there still seems to be there's gender stereotypes, and some schools, but still big emphasis on a university, whereas apprenticeships in some schools don't seem to be pushed quite so much. And teachers cannot know about every single job that's out there, but sometimes we've picked up at committee and elsewhere that the advice young people are getting doesn't really kind of cover the whole broad range of options that they could be getting. So, and I realise it's a very general question, but I just wonder if you have any thoughts about where we're going in the long term with trying to get young people like girls into engineering and that kind of thing.
I know we've got 3.5 hours, but I might take up most of that on that subject. I've said before that I think the careers element of the Withers report in the long term will be the most important part of the entire review that he carried out. There is absolutely no doubt in my view that we are coming up short in our careers offering. And there's a collective responsibility around that. It is not just about the careers advisors. It's not about teachers. One of the biggest influences on young people when it comes to making career choices are parents, the biggest influence. And if parents aren't alive to all of the opportunities that are out there, if they have prejudices, anti-apprenticeships, for example, it's a real problem. And we see the results of that in our attrition rates, in our apprenticeships, in our college dropouts, in our university dropouts. So there's, funnily enough, quite a lot of work being done, but it's the area of reform that I'm most optimistic about delivering in quickest, because we have a vehicle that was put together, the Careers Collaborative, which brings every aspect of the career service, everyone who should be influencing people's decisions on their career, into the room, round a table. And over the next few weeks and months, I will announce the new co-chairs of that, and also meet with them to pursue the very points that you are making, Mr Mason. Now, if you take around the gender point, it remains a huge issue. There is no doubt about that. Prejudices that exist within schools, within families. There are some careers for boys, some careers for girls. There's a useful piece of work done by SAB's gender group, which I intend to weave into all of the reform as a matter of course, because I think it was really useful looking at addressing these issues. The point about universities, yes, we all know that there are some institutions where that push for academic performance with a view to going to university remains the overarching approach within that school. But there are many other schools where that is not the case. There are many enlightened schools which are embracing different ways of coming at this. Where it's worked best, in my opinion, is where you have the careers advisors sitting in the school doing what they do with a knowledge of the landscape, where you have DYW operating in the school, complementing that work, and where you've got a school leadership that is focused on the right outcomes for every child and not simply trying to get them to go to university. So there's lots of good practice. My job over the next few months is to try and pull that together and to get everyone to take responsibility for their part of that, because it's not just about schools, it's about the careers advice that's available in colleges, within universities and within the home. And we need to fundamentally address this, meet this challenge of making sure that our young people in particular have the best set of information available to them to make the right choice for them.
I realise it's a big subject, but thanks very much for that. Okay, thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Just before I go to Joe Fitzpatrick, could I go back to the Minister for Children, Young People and the Promise? Minister, can I ask you, do you agree with John Mason when he says it's almost an impossible barrier to expect Liz Smith to meet and almost negotiate with trade unions and COSLAs over teacher contracts with her bill? Is that appropriate to ask the member in charge to do that, or are there other mechanisms that could be used?
I don't think it's appropriate to negotiate. I certainly wouldn't I certainly wouldn't class that as appropriate for either myself or the member in charge. However, I do believe, and I've said this in my correspondence to Ms Smith, that it is appropriate for her to engage with COSLA and trade unions to at least have more of an understanding about some of the implications and be able to relay that to government. But in terms of negotiating, no, I don't think that's appropriate.
So you would be satisfied with Ms Smith meeting with COSLA, trade unions, listening to them, reporting back, and that would effectively be her element of that request satisfied?
I don't know if I could say at the moment I would be wholly satisfied, but I think that would be very significant progress. So absolutely, I think that would be very helpful.
So if that didn't satisfy you, what further would she need to do to meet your aspirations of her as a member in charge with regard to these meetings? Because I agree with Mr Mason that certainly on paper it does seem like a barrier that's been put in place. Now, I'm encouraged by what you're saying. I just want to be very clear what your expectations are from those meetings.
As I say, at the moment, I would just like those meetings to take place. That is something that I have really relayed to Ms Smith in correspondence, and I will consider that once those conversations have taken place.
OK, thank you, Minister. And we'll go to Joe Fitzpatrick.
Thanks very much, Convener. My substantive question will be around Dundee University, but I want to pick up on a few areas that other members have already touched on. First of all, I want to go back to the Convener's point around the additional pressures that teachers are facing just now, and how we support teachers in tackling some of that. Obviously, one of the challenges the Scottish Government has is, while Cabinet Secretary, you are responsible for setting national education policy, as I think you said in response, local authorities are directly responsible for delivery. So how do we make sure that these are the issues raised by the Convener are really important and really impacting on children and young people's educations? So how do we make sure that we are working together as one, the Scottish Government, local authorities, and I think crucially our trade unions and staff members to make sure that we're tackling some of that when sometimes there are conflicts in terms of what people want to get out of it, but everybody wants to do what's best for the young folk.
So I thank Mr Fitzpatrick for the question. I mean, we've talked today in the round about some of the pressures facing our teaching workforce, not least in terms of behaviour, additional support needs, expectations, and more broadly, I've engaged substantially with our professional associations on all of these points, and they've been really key to driving some of the change we've seen. So the behaviour, the National Action Plan on Behaviour was quite a departure and a shift actually in tone from the government on this issue, and I don't know to what extent members have reflected that, but talking about behaviour in schools has actually been a shift, and I think we need to accept that and accept that there is a challenge, and I've been really upfront about that for the last 2.5 years, because I know from my friends who are not politicians about how difficult it is in schools just now, and I know through my engagement with trade unions, with head teachers as well. So something's happening in our schools post-pandemic. We saw that in the BISA research, but we also see that across the world. I alluded to the UN work on this, changes in behaviour, dysregulation, changing the type of learning and teaching you have. So the substantive question from Mr Fitzpatrick was support for teachers. So a couple of points I would make on that. One, the new Centre for Teaching Excellence. I announced that now in 2023, and we've now had the host institution of Glasgow, and in the coming weeks we will announce opportunities for staff to take part in the Centre for Teaching Excellence, which I think will be key. That is an offer to the profession. It is quite unique. It's about pedagogy, it's about excellent learning and teaching. We know that makes a difference, and I think in recent times we forgot some of that thread. So we need to go back to the bread and butter of good quality classroom teaching that makes a difference at the chalk face. So that Centre for Teaching Excellence is an offer for teachers to come out of school, to have that secondment, that opportunity to engage in academic practice and to go back out into the system. Second point is in relation to reducing class contact. To me, that's fundamental. You've got to free up teachers to engage in the processes that we want to drive in terms of educational improvement on education reform. You do that through reducing their workload, reducing class contact. Now, in order to deliver that, I have got to work through that tripartite structure with our professional associations and, of course, with COSLA. And that's not been without frustration. I think members will know that. And the point the member makes in relation to teacher numbers is exactly in a similar space. I can talk about how I've protected funding at national level for teacher numbers, but it's very challenging when local authorities then take decisions at local authority level to take that extra money and cut regardless. Now, I think that budget agreement we've reached with COSLA has been in good faith, and so I will expect them all to go back to 2023 levels, because that's what the budget, with extra funding, provided for. But in so doing, they had to make substantive progress, or progress rather, in relation to reducing class contact. Now, we put forward a suggestion on how that might work back in February to the tripartite group. COSLA said we needed more time, so they will be coming forward with a paper in the coming weeks before the end of this term, as I understand it, in relation to their proposals on how that might work, because I think we do need to talk about the practicalities of it. In primary schools it will look different, and it's arguably a bit more challenging to deliver in primary schools. In secondary schools, perhaps more easy. And then more broadly, how do we have that working relationship? Well, the new Education Assurance Board, which was a key part of the budget agreement, brings government and COSLA to the table. We have to work together on responding to the challenge, whether that be on teacher permanency, on how we support ASN in our schools, or on reducing class contact. We have to have that partnership approach with COSLA, otherwise we will not be able to deliver the change that I think we all want to see in our classrooms.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in terms of having some space for teachers to do other things. And one of the challenges that teachers are facing, in addition to the particular one that the convener raised earlier, was increases in numbers of children who are neurodivergent and require support around that. I recently visited Sidlow View Primary School in my constituency, where the head teacher there told us how she was trying to go the extra mile to kind of pull together for the school using the Together to Thrive model, where the teachers were working with parents to try and make sure, recognising, I think as you said, Cabinet Secretary, recognising that schools now do much more than just educate, and for some families in particular, they're almost the centre, the one stable part of a family's life. So the head teacher there is working with parents, with other third parties, to make sure that there's a holistic support for children. So I wonder if you're aware of the Together to Thrive, which isn't just in Dundee, it's in a few other schools as well. And if not, if you would like to maybe join me in visiting either the one I visited in Dundee or another one somewhere else.
So I thank Mr Fitzpatrick for his question. I'm not actually aware of the Together to Thrive programme specifically, but I'm more than happy to engage on a visit with the member, perhaps during the summer recess, or when the schools go back rather, to learn a bit more about how it works. I think to the substantive point in relation to engagement with parents, no behaviour improvement plan is going to work unless you have the buy-in and the support of parents. And we have seen that consistently in relation to the way in which head teachers have taken forward bans on mobile phones, for example. That doesn't work if you don't get the buy-in of mum and dad or parents and carers. So you've got to get that buy-in from home. And when I launched the mobile phone guidance back in August at Stonelaw High School, I think, talking to the head teacher there about the work she'd undertaken with the school community, with the kids, to mine their own data with parents and carers, to look at how much time they were spending online, screen time. She got the buy-in of her whole school community in doing that. It took time, but it was the right approach for her school. And I think exactly the same approach should apply in relation to behaviour. Many parents and carers are struggling post-pandemic. They come to the school because often it's a service that's open. So it is a constant in a young person's life, but it's also a constant for many of our parents and carers, where they're unable to obtain support from elsewhere. So they go to their school. I was in a school in Dundee actually last summer, I think, learning about approaches they were using through the PEF funding to support income maximisation officers, to support families with the cost of bills. These are not things 10 years ago we would have countenanced that SAC funding would have been used for. So undoubtedly, that funding is now being used to meet a wider range of families' needs, I would argue. That does help to close the poverty-related attainment gap. However, I do think we need to be mindful of how we have that support going to parents, but coming back to the school. And again, happy to give my support to a visit with Mr Fitzpatrick in the near future.
Thank you very much. Moving to the Minister for Children and Young People. Obviously, my constituency, Dundee, is one of the government's early adopter communities for ALC. So I wonder if you could give us a bit of update about how that's working, what that's doing, and just give a bit of an insight.
Of course, Mr Fitzpatrick. So our 6 early adopter communities are backed by £16 million of Scottish Government investment. And I think it comes back to a lot of what I was saying earlier around the extra time projects. They're providing really valuable insights into what it is that families require. Over and above just that childcare, actually our early adopter community projects are involved in a number of things in relation to supporting families as well. So I think it's really key in terms of the learning that we'll take forward from this. In relation to Mr Fitzpatrick's specific constituency in Dundee, I know that Dundee City Council are working in partnership with local providers such as the Yard to deliver services designed to respond to local needs and also supporting families with children with additional support needs, something that's been much discussed at the committee today. So they provide activities not only during the school days and holidays, but they also support families through weekend sessions that provide opportunities for families to play, to sort of come together with their children, but also to meet with other families and gain a form of sort of peer support. And I think opportunities like that are really, really key for families, especially in our kind of post-pandemic world, where those opportunities to come together to share information sounds so sort of formal, but to share support really and garner support of your peers, and equally in terms of children's development and them having opportunities for play. So I think the Yard are really doing fundamental work, and actually it stretches over and above just what is being carried out in terms of services from the Yard, because I know that they've been helping and able to provide additional training to other school-age childcare projects in Dundee. So it's actually having a much further reach than perhaps what it looks like on paper. So it's been really positive, and as I say, going forward, I think that the learning and the outcomes that we will be able to evaluate from the work going on in the early adopters is again going to be really instrumental in terms of going forward with increasing school-age childcare more generally.
Excellent, thanks. Moving on to briefly onto preschool childcare. Obviously, the increasing access to hours is really helpful to parents, particularly in terms of being able to get back to work. One of the challenges, though, is sometimes that provision can be rigid and doesn't work around the demands of actually having a job in the real world. So a couple of weeks ago, myself and my colleague Shona Robertson visited the Fintry Mains nursery, not in my constituency, but it is in the patch that I used to be a local councillor for, where the Flexible Childcare Service Scotland were supporting childcare, which did actually work around, wrap around parents' needs in terms of being able to get out and go to work, which we know has a huge benefit in terms of tackling child poverty and all of the challenges that come thereafter. How can we support that kind of model to be more accessible? The parents there were amazing. That all of the folk who worked there were just so passionate about what they were doing, but clearly not all preschool provision is as flexible.
Absolutely. In relation to the specific example that Mr Fitzpatrick's raised, I think cost is an issue in terms of providing that sort of 24/7 available childcare. But I think in terms of the actions that we're taking, some of what I've already alluded to this morning around the early adopter work and the extra time, we are really trying to provide and understand and be able to build that system of flexible childcare. One of the sort of key priorities in relation to the 1140 expansion was flexibility and ensuring that parents are able to access the childcare that they require in terms of fitting round their working life or whatever it may be. And I think I've already alluded to the point this morning that there is no family that's the same. One size doesn't fit all in relation to this. But I think going forward, we do have a system in place to evaluate our ELC expansion, the 1140 expansion, that will be publishing later this year in December. And I think, before I go into that, I should have perhaps said flexibility is one of the keys of the 1140 expansion, but we know that we've got further to go in terms of ensuring that all parents do have that, ability to access that flexible childcare. And there's a number of issues that impact on that. That could be, our rural communities face different challenges, our island communities face different challenges. So there are a number of factors that I think need to be considered in this, and we're taking action in a number of those different ways. I've already spoke about some of the pilot projects. We're also looking at how to overcome some of the barriers and challenges for rural and island communities. So there's a number of things in in progress that I think will help with this. But in terms of that kind of overall understanding how that flexibility is playing out on the ground, I think our evaluation of the expansion of 1140 later in the year will be absolutely key, and perhaps might allow us to build on some of the actions that we're already taking to try to ensure that parents have that access.
Brilliant, thanks very much. Moving to the Minister for Higher and Further Education. Obviously, it's now been some time since the situation in Dundee University came to light, and while there's perhaps less immediate stress than there was at the start, it's still a stressful situation for staff and students. There's still a lack of understanding of exactly when there's going to be clarity about how the university is going to be taken forward in a sustainable way and what that will mean for individual staff and potentially students in terms of their courses. So it would be good if you're able to give us a bit of an update around that, and just give us some assurance that what feels like a protracted timescale might be coming to an end soon.
Okay, Kavira, this may take a little bit of time. I hope you'll indulge me on this. I understand entirely the stress and the frustration that's been felt by the staff and others at how long this has taken, how long this has dragged on for. I could speak for the CABSEC as well and say that we've certainly been frustrated by the time it's taken. I think at various points in this, we've had to recognise that the role of ministers in this, in the context of legislation and our relationship with universities, is at play, and so, of course, is protecting ONS classification. I think what also has contributed to this is, obviously, this was a very complex situation in terms of the finance of the university and understanding how they got into the situation they're in. So that took a bit of time. As we moved through that, I think there's also, if we're absolutely candid about this, been an element of everybody involved in it wanting to be absolutely sure of the numbers in front of them, particularly around the asks, but also around the robustness of 2 iterations of a financial recovery plan. And more recently, I think what we've seen is the university being expected, rightly so, by the SFC to bring forward a level of detail that really underpins what's been placed in front of the SFC. And that, in turn, has seen the court of the university take a very, and rightly so, a very keen interest in that. And I think that has contributed to the delays. Now, of course, it goes to the SFC, and the SFC's board is involved. So that's the background to perhaps as to why it has taken as long as it has. More up to date, on the 28th of May, the SFC received a further financial ask, and I think people are aware of that. That had gone through the university's processes. It has been going through the processes of the SFC in terms of interrogating the nature of the ask, the SFC's board. The Scottish Government formally received that on that request, or notification of that request, on the 6th of June. We are working on that at pace. This is an ongoing situation within government. Indeed, the cross-ministerial group meets this afternoon. We meet regularly on this. I should say as well that the CABSEC has led a lot of direct engagement with the trade unions, because I think that's been an important part of this. The ask that's that's been brought forward, the additional ask to the 22 million, has 2 elements to it. The first one is to support the avoiding the scale of the disruption that was proposed, particularly in employment terms, in the first iteration of the financial recovery, which would have been quite destructive to the employment levels. And nobody, I think, was in any way comfortable with that. The second one is around liquidity. It's self-evident that the institution got itself into difficulty because it essentially was living beyond its means. That won't be recovered overnight. Whilst the financial recovery plan is implemented and taken forward, the institution will recover a degree of further support, whether that comes from commercial sources, from the government, or a combination of the two. And those are the 2 elements of the ask that has come forward. And those are being progressed, as I said, at pace. I do think that we ought now, famous last words, to be capable of moving into a phase where we can see a greater pace injected into taking this forward. Clearly, we have an ask now that we can assist them with in whatever form. The VSS scheme has finally been launched. That will allow that element of this to be progressed. The task force, and I should commend Sir Alan Langlands and his team both for the patience they've shown and the commitment. They are now conducting very specific work streams here to assist the university. There has been no shortage of appetite on the part of the members of the task force to assist. I commend them for that, but they have needed the information and the encouragement to deliver in the way that they would hope to, and they're now taking that forward. And of course, in terms of progressing this and bringing it to a head, if that's the term, the Gillis report is due next week. Now, obviously, primarily, that is for the SFC who commissioned the report to respond to, but also the university, because they will have to respond to the findings. As I understand it, at the lunchtime of the day that the report's published, they'll be holding a town hall meeting with staff at the university to give them an insight into what first of all, what the review has found, but also, I would hope, any actions that the university feels necessary to take in the immediate term. But as I've said previously at committee, it is also for the government to reflect on the findings of the report, and if there are any clear issues around governance and oversight which have repercussions or ramifications beyond the University of Dundee, then, as I've said before, the Tertiary Education Bill provides a vehicle for us to look at legislating, perhaps giving further powers to the SFC or whatever. But we await the report.
Thanks very much. It was good to hear about the engagement with the CABSEC and trade unions, because I think there still is a feeling by certainly locally that the trade unions don't feel that they're being properly and meaningfully engaged in the process. So that's good to know that government's at least making that reaching out there. You mentioned that you now have an ask. Has that ask been agreed to, or is there a timescale for getting that clarity? Which is obviously
to go back to your point about the trade unions, there is no doubt that within that institution there has been a long-standing mistrust and distrust between trade unions and senior management that has not been helped by the events that we're discussing here today. And it has been quite concerning to see the nature of some of the engagement. I don't think it's necessarily matched what we would have hoped for or expected in terms of engagement with the trade unions. But I think there are some hopeful signs more recently that is improving. In terms of timescale, I can't sit here today and say, and I wasn't hinting, by the way, that the meeting this afternoon would be to decide on that ask. All I'll say is we have been well aware of the urgency here to provide a bit of confidence, a bit of certainty in all of this, and the government will move as quickly as it can to deal with the ask. But as I said, there are two elements to the ask. One may be take a bit longer to deal with than the other.
Okay. It might be helpful to hear from Cabinet Secretary about the engagement of trade unions, because it is an issue that is concerning, so it would be good.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Fitzpatrick. So engagement with trade unions throughout the process has been really fundamental. I went to Dundee, as Mr Fitzpatrick will know, some months ago now to meet with them directly. And the breakdown in that relationship, as Mr Fitzpatrick will know, is historical to some extent, but has crystallised through events of recent months. Our engagement with the trade unions has been really key to all that we've done throughout this process. So I've been very keen every other week to meet with them directly, to hear from them, to test their thinking, to make sure the flow of information is coming as they would expect it to hear the members of their views throughout what has been a really challenging time for them and for staff across the university. And again, just want to put my note on the record to that end, because I know it's been really challenging for them, and ministers are here to help and to support. That's been the role that I've been playing as CABSEC alongside Mr Day as Minister. We met with them most recently last Thursday. Felt like things at that point were in a better space, and of course with the VSS scheme launch on Friday, which I think has hopefully also helped. The issues that Mr Fitzpatrick has raised in relation to the government being able to say something, we are very keen to say something as soon as we are able to. We have to respect the processes here. He will understand this is about public money, and therefore it's really essential that the SFC, for example, in relation to their governance processes, have to be able to carry that out regardless of ministers. So that needs to be a set aside, but we hope to be able to say something as soon as we are able to in relation to the support that we are able to provide Dundee University.
That's really helpful. In terms of the recovery plan, there's still a significant reliance on international students. We had some principals in last week who talked to us about some of the challenges around international students. We've now got the new UK government's approach to migration, and it kind of feels like rather than helping the situation with international students, that might be more challenging. Has government made an assessment of the white paper and the potential harms of further restrictions on our international student populations at universities?
If I take that, I mean, that really, in terms of the reliance on international students that may be baked into the financial recovery plan, that's a matter for the SFC to look at, and they have been looking at that because it's a very valid point. But you're right to point to the factors out with what we might have reasonably expected to be factored into the FRP, which is things like fresh pronouncements on the direction of travel and inward migration. It is a fact that the universities will tell you that even conversations instigated by government around international students have a detrimental effect. They can see it. They pick it up in their numbers that people say, we're not wanted there, we'll go elsewhere. And there is no doubt that the pronouncements in the white paper are in that space, and if enacted, certainly have the potential to be further, to deliver further detriment on the sector. So you're absolutely right, and this is one of the things that perhaps takes that bit longer as you look at projections that are underpinning some of this and interrogating whether they will hold up under the potential stresses that are going to come down the track in the next 6 months and a year. So that level of interrogation is going on.
Thanks very much. I have other questions, Convener, but I know that Mr Rennie wants to follow up in terms of Dundee University, so I'm happy to wait to see if we've got time.
Thank you. I will take in a couple of members just on Dundee University, and first of all, Willie Rennie.
I understand that the Minister can't tell us whether there will be a financial agreement with Dundee. I understand that. There's still an awful lot of work to be done, including due diligence. But it's been reported that the figure involved from the ask is about £100 million. Can the Minister confirm that that is the figure? And secondly, can he confirm that if the due diligence goes well, that that money will be available to be awarded?
He's right to talk about the need to carry out due diligence. And I'm not going to get into specific numbers. There are, to be blunt, there are a range of numbers at play here. And as I've also already alluded to, how that liquidity element of what might be asked for is delivered can be done in a variety of ways. I've mentioned commercial lending and how you might unlock that. So I would separate this into two component parts, as I've done a moment ago, and given the assurance that we have been very clear about our commitment to deliver for the future of Dundee. How exactly that's done, we will see, but we're absolutely clear in our support for the institution as we've been throughout.
There's a bit of well, there's an assumption that the bank will come back on board if the government provides this level of support. I assume as part of this due diligence that there is a discussion either between the university and the bank or the SFC and the bank. Can you guarantee that that is happening? And second of all, that he has confidence that the package will be able to be delivered if it's agreed?
I'll reiterate something I said earlier about ministers and their distance from this in terms of legislation and ONS classification. But my understanding is that there have been and continue to be conversations between the institution and commercial lenders.
Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Minister, could I just, to follow up on Willie Rennie's points there, you said the SFC have interrogated the request. Without telling us, confirming what the initial request was, has the request that's gone from the SFC to the Scottish Government now on the 6th of June, is it the same quantum that was asked for on the 28th of May?
In a broad sense, it is, Convener, but there's a bit of variation in the figures, if I can put it that way. There are two ends to this, and there are two elements, as I've made clear as well. There is an element around the adjustment in the approach the university has taken in terms of, in part, the employment levels that are protected, and then there is that point about liquidity, that, if you like, that bridging that goes on whilst they implement the FRP and get themselves back into a position not just from which they survive but they thrive.
In terms of the request, previously some of the money was found through SFC in money they would have had to have returned to the Scottish Government anyway, and then there was a further top-up by the Scottish Government. Is the indication this time that the SFC will provide any of the funding requested, or will it all be borne by the Scottish Government and then sent back through the SFC because of the ONS classification?
That's obviously a matter that has been looked at currently, but given the financial pressures that the SFC have, I think it would be fair to say it is more likely that funding that was provided for this purpose, public funding, would have to come from government via the SFC.
Okay. And I'll come back to one other point on Dundee University, but just on this general theme, last week obviously we had Edinburgh University in front of us. They're looking to make £140 million of savings. 90 million of that will be in staffing, so hundreds, potentially over 1,000 staff being made redundant. Now, previously, when the Dundee University was looking at over 700 members of staff, the government stepped in and said, you can support that. I fully understand there's no request at all, from what we're aware, from University of Edinburgh for funding. But if the Scottish Government didn't want to see 700 people losing their jobs in Edinburgh, in Dundee, do you share similar concerns about people losing their jobs in Edinburgh? And would financial support be available to an institution like Edinburgh, even though they're not asking for it at the moment?
You do not want to see job losses on any scale. But one of the issues that we have in our university, and I think I alluded to this when I was here the last time, Convener, is that a number of our universities are have an approach whereby they take on several hundred staff on the back of an emerging market, and if circumstances change, they then shed several hundred staff. And that is something, frankly, the universities need to get out of, because it's not a healthy situation at all. The difference between Edinburgh and Dundee is, yes, there were substantial job losses being required at the University of Dundee, but the situation was also so serious that there was a question mark about the future of the institution. We were talking about saving a critical university in Scotland. So I don't think they're comparative, but I do take your point as well about the scale of the job losses that are being talked about at Edinburgh.
And then just finally back to Dundee University, you spoke about the Pamela Gillis report coming next week. Have you had any indication that it will definitely be delivered next week, or any indication that there any delay, or as far as you're aware, it will come next week? As far as you can tell us.
I'm laughing, Convener, because we've just been talking about how long some of this has taken and how it's dragged on. All I can say to you is that our understanding and expectation, and we've heard nothing to suggest otherwise, is it will be next week. And I know that will be of interest to the committee.
Yeah, and that will be very welcomed by the committee as well. Mr Fitzpatrick, I heard you had more questions. We'll maybe go through the others first and come back to you if we have time after that. So I'll go now to Ross Greer.
Thank you, Convener, and my questions, I think, probably all going to be for the Cabinet Secretary, I'm afraid. Starting off on teacher work codes, it's been about a decade since there was a real drive to reduce unnecessary bureaucracy for teachers. That was just before and kind of overlapping the point at which the Cabinet Secretary and I were elected here. So you have experienced that directly as a teacher before coming here. And as much as we can all point to specific examples of areas of bureaucracy that have been removed, every teacher I speak to, every union representing them says that overall the issue of bureaucracy has got worse over the last decade. Do you agree with that? Do you think there is too much bureaucracy involved in teaching, both for classroom teachers but also those in management positions?
Yes, I mean, I think broadly with the member's point, I would agree. I do remember the reducing bureaucracy work. I think it may have been led by one Michael Russell back in 2014, because I think I was a principal teacher at the time. And I remember running a department meeting, and at the end of us looking at re-evaluating the broad general education, looking at all of our units across the course, considering senior phase arrangements, we got to reducing bureaucracy. So we have to look in the round at what we're asking our classroom teachers and our head teachers and principal teachers to deliver. And when we talk about unnecessary workload, I'm really keen to talk to the professional associations about what we mean by that in terms of local authority level. Because actually, I was discussing this with officials earlier on, there's very little that the government asks for at national level that drives teacher workload. Much of teacher workload, certainly in my own experience, is driven at local authority level through things that the professional associations might quite rightly argue are not about learning and teaching and more about administration. So I think there's a body of work we need to undertake. I discussed this with the NASUWT actually very recently on revisiting that reducing bureaucracy agenda. It speaks to, I think, the work on reducing class contact, reducing teacher workload to create the time that is needed. Many of these tasks we know should not necessarily be, I think, for the kind of working day for classroom teachers. They are driven at local authority level. They differ across the country in terms of reporting requirements, what systems are used, how that's inputted, how often it's required of each and every class you teach. So we don't have a national approach to this, which has been a bit of a key theme of today's discussions. But I may bring in Graham just to talk to the specifics that we ask for at national level. Anything else is being driven at local authority level. So I do accept the point Mr Greer raises around about reducing bureaucracy more broadly.
Thanks very much, Cabinet Secretary. And Mr Greer's right to point out that over the last 10 years, things like the HMI review of unnecessary bureaucracy, the definitive guidance on the curriculum. I think we also discussed this with the International Council of Education Advisors, and as the Cabinet Secretary said, they were encouraging us to identify what are the really specific things that are driving workload. And the Cabinet Secretary is correct in that the data we collect nationally is a very small part of that in terms of what we ask for from schools. It's data that goes into CMIS largely, for example, around attendance and data on curriculum for excellence. So I think we need to look at this not just nationally but through LNCTs and work with local government colleagues, and also at school level when schools are looking at their working time agreements as well. And we are taking forward some innovative work to try and reduce workload, such as our Civitech Challenge, which colleagues may be aware is the Scottish Government's Technology Accelerator programme, brings together private sector, academia and experts to solve public sector problems. And we're working with them and with local government partners to develop tools using AI to support teachers with administrative tasks, for example, in relation to additional support for learning. And the aim there is to save time and improve the quality and accuracy of information, whilst also complying, obviously, with ethical and data protection and so on. So I think we need to look at opportunities like that to reduce workload in administration in particular. And the next phase of that programme is going to look at other opportunities where technologies could reduce workload as well.
I agree with the broad thrust of your answers that a lot of the additional and unnecessary workload, particularly bureaucratic workload, is being driven by local authorities. Absolutely, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Not all of it, though. There are some areas where it is driven by government, and there are some areas where local authorities are only able to add on all this bureaucracy because of a particular government initiative. So to use one example, and it is a very politicised one, SNSAs. Primary one SNSAs, there is a parliamentary majority against them. In the last session of Parliament, there was a vote. Parliament decided that there should not be a continuation of P1 SNSAs, and yet the government has continued to do so. And when I speak to teachers and they give me examples of the kind of unnecessary bureaucracy they have to deal with, SNSAs come up a lot, not because the test in and of itself is particularly time-consuming, though the Cabinet Secretary will be aware of my position that it doesn't add much value and it causes a lot of stress and anxiety, but a lot of the bureaucracy that schools and local authorities then add on top of that. There are significant additional reporting requirements that a number of local authorities have bolted on to SNSAs. would the Cabinet Secretary reflect on that, that as much as, yes, a lot of this is driven by local authorities, there are many examples where they wouldn't be able to do so if it wasn't because of a particular government policy. And in the case of this particular policy, Primary 1 standardised testing, Parliament has told government to stop, and yet the government has continued with those tests.
So I'll take Mr Greer's point before I bring in Graham Logan to talk about some of the changes we've made to the SNSAs, reflecting on the points he's made. He talked about the significant additional reporting being required. I'm so old I can remember sitting around this exact table with Mr Greer in the previous session talking about these exact issues and talking about workload associated at that time from local authorities doing lots of different things in relation to how they measured attainment. And if we remember the rationale behind the SNSAs, and I accept there were lots of debates at the time about it, it was about having that consistent approach across the country. We've heard today about inconsistency and what that does for children and young people, for parents, for teachers. So it was about having a consistent approach to gathering that data. I am aware, though, however, to Mr Greer's point, that some local authorities, in addition to the SNSAs, or the SNAS as some call them, have their own reporting mechanisms that they have kept in place. So that has increased workload as a result. Now, we've reflected on that through some of the changes we've brought forward through the SNSAs that I'll bring Graham in to speak to momentarily. But I don't accept the fundamental point that workload more broadly is being driven by asks from the government. I'm happy for Graham to talk to some of the specifics on the SNSAs, but if I could just reflect on a really crude example from my own experience in schools some time ago now, we need to think about the administrative tasks that classroom teachers are often asked to do. So, for example, my department used to have an associated element of classroom support that we would have once a week for data entry. For example, when we're looking at pupil reports, that was something that was taken off my desk and somebody would deal with that on an administrative level. And that was really helpful to me to free me up, to allow me to do more planning, more marking, other things that I could undertake during my free period. So there are ways in which local authorities can also help to drive workload, but also assist it. And of course, the budget, which Mr Greer's party voted for, helped to provide extra funding to support ASN and extra teachers, which we know makes a difference. And some of that funding can be used by local authorities to help alleviate teacher workload too. But if I could bring in Graham on some of the substantive changes to the SNSAs.
Thanks very much, Cabinet Secretary. Yeah, and I think on the SNSA example, some of the things and the way that's been implemented was to try and reduce bureaucracy and workload. For example, the fact that schools can choose the time that they use that assessment, so there's not a fixed window in the way that standardised assessment is used in some other parts of the UK and elsewhere. So teachers and schools can decide when would it be useful in a diagnostic way to use that tool in a flexible way, and indeed to integrate it into classroom practice so that it's not a kind of extra task, and of course to use the data in an actionable way. But I think Mr Greer's right, some of the tracking and monitoring systems that then are layered on top of that can add to workload and bureaucracy. So we're really keen to continue working with local partners and with Education Scotland to look at the tracking and monitoring that adds value but is light in terms of the bureaucracy, because we want all the data that teachers use to be actionable and to make a difference to improving children's progress and achievement.
That all sounds good, but my frustration with it is a lot of it's talk of work that we need to continue doing, work that we will continue doing. And Cabinet Secretary, as you've just reflected, you were sat around this table almost a decade ago with myself, Liz Smith and others who are still here talking about this. It was an issue before that when you were yourself a teacher. Why is this such a perennial issue, given that a lot of the other issues that we're talking about, ultimately resource constraints are what underlie them, areas like additional support needs, etc., or even the connected issues you've just talked about, like schools having administrative support staff. A lot of the issues around the bureaucratic elements of teacher workload, though, have no-cost solutions, or solutions that would in fact generate savings if that workload was reduced. And I accept some of that would require national government being much more prescriptive to local government than it is currently, and in a way that would cause a lot of tension. But without getting into the specifics of that, this question is basically that I can't understand the lack of priority that is given to reducing teacher workload, particularly given that it is essentially a no-cost area of work that would generate significant goodwill with teachers, as well as, I think, lead to an improvement in the quality of learning and teaching.
So I think there is a clear focus on reducing teacher workload, but I take the member's point. Sorry.
You say that there's a clear focus on it. in starting these questions, though, you acknowledged, you accepted the premise of what I was starting with, which is that teacher workload has not got easier in the last 10 years and the bureaucracy around it has not reduced in the last 10 years. So if there's a focus on it, why are things not improving?
But I think this comes back to the challenge we've been talking today about the relationship between central government and local government and how that's enacted in our classrooms. So we've talked about the reality that workload in the main is not being driven by national government. In the main, as you all know, I don't have many levers that I can operate in relation to my relationship with local authorities. I have to work with them in partnership. What I've said to the professional associations is we need to revisit this agenda with our local government partners to ensure that they are not adding to teacher workload. One of the ways we can do that is through the curriculum improvement cycle, and I don't know if we're going to come on to talk about that this morning, because I know time is short. But the curriculum improvement cycle allows us an opportunity to re-evaluate what we are prescribing at national level and what we are allowing open to choice and local discretion. And one of the key features actually coming back from these head teacher events is the need for greater clarity, greater standardisation. Teachers want that to be spelled out for them in a way that I'm not necessarily sure we have done so through Curriculum for Excellence. There's arguably too much fluidity in the system, and that's not necessarily been as supportive as it could have been. And I think when you talk about reporting requirements, for example, or tracking and monitoring, if we had a bit more prescription and a bit more rigour in the system, particularly in primary, it would actually help to alleviate some of what's being asked for at local authority level, because you see local authorities doing lots of different things. If we had greater consistency, whether it be on ASN, on behaviour, on how you record literacy levels, it would automatically alleviate workload as a result. Now, I've been keen to press this point through the Education Assurance Board. We've also been in discussions with COSLA around about the role of CMIS. Mr Greer will know that's the main reporting system that's used in Scottish schools. It is quite clunky, it is quite old. I think there are different ways in which we might be able to work in the future. It doesn't join up with, for example, early years at the current time, although there's a new approach to that we've been developing. So I think in partnership with local government, I'm very keen to revisit this agenda. I appreciate the challenge Mr Greer puts. There's opportunity through curriculum improvement. There's also opportunity through education reform. Mr Greer will also know my cautiousness in relation to some of the work on education reform. That's because I was in a school not that long ago, and we need to be mindful about workload implications for changing our qualification system. The last time we did that, I'm not sure we reflected on that in the right way. So this time we have to work with the profession, which is why you've got people like Andy Brown, who's a maths specialist to trade and a former head teacher out on secondment right now. He's leading all of our work on numeracy. He's a subject specialist. He has credibility with the profession. But only through using the profession to drive this curriculum change can you also help to affect reducing workload. So the profession have to be part of leading, I think, some of the change we need to see in our curriculum, and in so doing alleviating the workload issues that Mr Greer has quite rightly raised at classroom level.
I think the solution here is more prescription for education authorities and more autonomy, professional autonomy for individual teachers and schools themselves. Just one final question on this, I'm conscious of time. Cabinet Secretary will be aware that I submitted a paper to the government that I commissioned Dr Joseph Smith and Professor Mark Priestley to do. It was essentially a series of focus groups and some research work with teachers on their suggestions for how to reduce their workload, specifically in relation to bureaucracy. So I submitted that to the government, I think just coming up on 2 years ago now. Has the government reflected on that, and will there be a response to that, or in some other way will the government be reflecting on the feedback it's getting from teachers who've provided a number of specific examples of areas where their bureaucratic workload can be reduced?
I think I'd be happy to engage with Mr Greer on the substances in relation to the paper that he submitted. I think he said some 2 years ago, but more broadly, any engagement on teacher workload, whilst having me at the table, has got to have COSLA, because we're not going to change things if we don't get local government in the room. So I'm happy to be here and give evidence for as many years as the committee will have me, but if we don't have COSLA as part of these discussions, we are not going to affect change in our classrooms.
I agree with that point entirely. There's some other issues I'd like to come back on around school psychologists and things, but conscious of time, conveners, I'm happy to come back to those at the end if there is time for it.
Can I do a wee sup on this point?
Okay, Joe Fitzpatrick would like to come in with us on this.
It's very much in terms of this point. Obviously, additional money has been given Cabinet Secretary for teacher numbers across Scotland. Are you aware of any councils that are not using that money to increase teacher numbers, and are there any councils which are actually cutting teacher numbers?
Well, through the budget agreement, I think, as I responded to Mr Rennie earlier on, we got an agreement from all local authorities through COSLA that they would work back to 2023 levels. I'm really pleased that that deal was made. It was made in good faith. It involved a lot of extra public money. It involved extra public money for teacher numbers and for additional supportees. So I can't believe there would be any local authority in Scotland just now that's taking that additional money from central government, who signed up to those conditions and to make meaningful progress on reducing class contact and is planning to reduce teacher numbers. We're engaging with a number of local authorities on the substantials, but our understanding is the budget deal remains absolute and that in good faith those local authorities will work back to 23 numbers. If they did that, then tomorrow I could deliver on reducing class contact in primary schools, because we know through our own independent modelling we would have enough teachers to do that in primary schools if they all went back to the 2023 level. So these things mustn't be divorced. It's really important when we talk about teacher numbers and reducing class contact. The two sit together, and having that sustainable workforce will help to allow for the freeing up of class contact, and in so doing allow teachers to engage in reform.
So Cabinet Secretary, my understanding is that South Lanarkshire Council have taken a decision to cut teacher numbers in spite of that additional funding. How concerning would that be for you if that is confirmed? I think it's in the public domain that that decision has been made by the Labour Authority.
I think it is in the public domain in relation to that local authority. What I would say is I have faith absolutely in COSLA that they will want to stand by this deal, and of course it was made in good faith. So we will continue to engage with councils such as South Lanarkshire Council to ensure that they maintain teacher numbers at 2023 levels, which was a requirement of the budget ask and the funding that went with it. And of course, we don't want to be in the cliff edge situation that cabinet secretaries prior to my time in office, and I have certainly faced, whereby we get the teacher census in December and there's a cliff edge moment as to whether or not the government will claw back funding. That's not a position I want to be in again. It's not a position any cabinet secretary should be in. We should operate in good faith. So when we make these agreements in good faith, then the government should quite rightly, I think, expect that they're delivered on. So we'll continue to work with local authorities to that end.
Thank you. We move to Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Ministers and your officials. I'm trying to think what the collective noun is for a group of ministers. I'll go with gaggle, maybe. I wanted to ask a number of questions, and they will be wide-ranging, but I wanted to start in relation to rural schools, because we have seen a decrease of 136 rural schools under this government. So I wanted to ask what impact assessment have ministers made, and the First Minister agreed to review mothballing guidance for schools and nurseries in April. So when will that be published?
So in terms of the mothballing guidance, I think Ms Dawn Innes gave a response to this earlier on, and we're going to engage with local authorities throughout the summer period in relation to responding to that consultation. I think Mr Briggs and his colleagues have asked me a number of written PQs on this recently, and it is a concern to me. We do have challenges across the country in relation to recruitment, and I think some of this is playing out in some of the challenge local authorities are experiencing. But the important point in all of this in relation to the mothballing or closure of schools is that that ultimately is a responsibility of local authorities. These schools belong to them, not to government ministers. So we need to respect their autonomy, but in so doing, we also need to work with them to support local communities. So it is a concern, but we're committed to working with COSLA. I think the updated guidance will go some way to alleviating some of that concern, and perhaps as well to alleviating the concerns that certainly parents and carers groups have raised with me in recent months.
That to be published before recess?
No, I do not expect it to be published before recess. The engagement, as I understand it, is to happen across the summer period. So.
Okay, thanks for that. Teacher numbers, as we've heard, they've fallen by 598 last year. So I just wanted to ask the Cabinet Secretary if she would confirm to committee that the Scottish Government will now not meet their pledge to recruit 3,500 additional teachers.
Well, I think in the round we have to accept that teacher numbers since 2014 have increased by, I think, over 2,500. But it is my clear expectation, which I think was the point Mr Fitzpatrick was making before he left the room, that teacher numbers will increase in the next year because we have put in that extra resource to allow local authorities to do that. If they are not able to do that, we can't deliver on reducing class contact. So again, it's the point I made previously. All of these things are inherently linked. And of course, our aspiration now is to go back to 2023 levels to allow us to deliver on reducing class contact.
And returning to the free school meals issue, because I think it's important to look at this in the round, and the Scottish Government, having ditched a pledge, have readapted that in recent years. But a Sunday Mail Freedom of Information investigation has reported that families now are facing a 20% increase in the cost of the price of school meals. These are families whose children are not eligible. So I wanted to ask, around the cost of the school day, what has the Scottish Government and COSLA been doing to engage with parents who are not entitled and that additional cost which families are facing?
Well, of course, I think I mentioned earlier on some of the action we're taking in relation to supporting local authorities with funding to help in relation to school trips, in relation to how we can support through the People Equity Fund. But the free school meal funding, and Mr Briggs is right to highlight this because it's been a challenge for the government, and I accept that. Discussed this with committee. We've also brought forward the SSI that I was recently at committee, and we talked about how we could broaden out eligibility through getting children who are in receipt of the Scottish Child Payment to be signed up to free school meals. But we know that free school meals at the current time is saving, I think I mentioned previously, families on average £450 per year. So it is making a difference. Now, Mr Briggs talks to the increase in relation to school meals. Undoubtedly, that has been impacted by inflationary costs rising. Everything is more expensive now. Wages are going up, so things do cost more. We do work with local authorities to that end, but they do have statutory responsibilities at local level. We've given them a significant uplift in their local settlement this year of over £1 billion, so it's significant extra funding going to local authorities and local government. And we know that many local authorities, for example, do not pursue school meal debt. That's a gift, that's a power in the gift of local authorities, that they can decide not to do that. We set out previously guidance on this, actually working with COSLA to the point the member has asked me about, to be very clear about our expectations. So we also made funding available, extra funding to help local authorities write off school meal debt as well. So there are a range of measures we've been taking to work with councils to help alleviate the costs associated with that, but also to support families more broadly.
Thank you for that. I wanted to also return to an issue which I've raised with the Housing Minister, but also with other ministers in relation to the number of children living in temporary accommodation and their education delivery, because we know that under this government there's 10,360 homeless children living in temporary accommodation. Here in the capital there are 3,127. Now, I've consistently raised the issue about children moving schools when they're in temporary accommodation and asking for a presumption against pupils being moved school. Now, I understand that this was meant to be being discussed within the Ministerial Oversight Group. That's what I was last told on the 4th of March. So can you update committee on where the government are on that policy? Because there seems to be very little progress.
As I understand it, there's to be a meeting of the Child Poverty Group on Monday of this coming week, but I'm more than happy to write to the committee on that to discuss these issues in the round. I know there are significant issues here in relation to temporary housing. I very much support the point the member has made in relation to consistency of educational provision, particularly when a child has that disruption in their private life. So I support the points the member has made, but I will come back to him on the substances in relation to my engagement with CAPSEC Social Justice.
I'd be grateful for that, and if possible before the start of the new school year.
Absolutely.
This being put in place. I wanted to also touch upon VAT on the independent school sector. It's something I've raised with the Cabinet Secretary a number of times, various letters with Treasury, and just wondered what assessment government's now made of that impact to date, and when she maybe last met with representatives of the sector as well.
So I met with Scottish Council for Independent Schools, I think last year, to talk about some of their concerns here, relayed those to the UK Government. This is a policy position that they have taken. I have to say it's one that the Government in Scotland does support. We were told originally that there would be clear consequentials for Scotland in relation to VAT. I think the members actually asked me a number of written PQs on this. That seems to have changed now in terms of how that budget allocation has been made. So we're now no longer able to make that differentiation, which is quite challenging because we understood there would be additional monies coming to Scotland as a result of that movement. That's not been the case. We stayed very close to Scottish Council for Independent Schools throughout. Our officials engaged with them very regularly, but also through our engagement with COSLA. And I think more recently, though I don't have the numbers to hand, I responded to the member in a written PQ with the detail and the data. We also know, and I know the member is particularly interested in this, that this issue affects Edinburgh more so than other local authorities in Scotland because of the number of young people who are enrolled in the private sector. Our modelling and our understanding is that there is capacity within the school estate currently to absorb any pupils coming out of the private sector. But if Mr Briggs has examples where that's not the case, I'm more than happy to hear them today and to engage directly with Edinburgh City Council or other local authorities he might want to raise.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for that, and she'll be aware of Edinburgh City Council having the highest pupil-teacher ratio, which is my greatest concern, and changes in behaviour, because I think one of the key bits of information we are receiving is actually around primary school levels not being what they would have been in the independent sector, and where the Scottish Government and Edinburgh City Council maybe aren't live to that sort of impact. So I would like to maybe take the Cabinet Secretary up on that offer around data, because I think it's really important for the next school year to be on top of that. Yeah. Just finally, I wanted to ask the Minister for Higher and Further Education, one of my favourite topics, and his as well, in relation to clawback for funding for universities. I've done a number of visits recently with universities where they have outlined that if there was a new model around that clawback, money already being given to the sector, that they would actually be in a much better financial space. So I wondered what review will take place around this, especially around part-time studying opportunities which could be developed, especially in relation to the social care and the workforce around the NHS, and different models which are being put forward, and just what sort of review will take place around that. Because given all the issues we are acutely aware around the higher and further education finances, this does seem like a positive solution being put forward at this moment in time.
On the topic of recovery, which is the phrase that's used rather than clawback, Mr Briggs, this is something that the SFC has done a lot of work on with the college sector, particularly through the tripartite group, and it has been extremely successful. What I would say to you is, however, there is a point at which these are public monies that recirculate in the education system, and leaving monies in institutions that have underperformed, and I'll come back to that point in a moment, I don't think can be justified if there is no evidence that they are seeking not to underperform. And there are in some instances where that has been the case and there has been some flexibility provided. What I would say in response overall to the question is, I'm sure this is a topic that will be explored in greater detail through the university tripartite group. I think there are limitations to what can be done in this space, given the financial pressures that we're all aware of. Nevertheless, I think where universities are doing innovative things in the areas that you've referred to and others, I think there is an argument for a bit of understanding there. And I'm sure, as I say, that will be explored further through the tripartite group.
And as part of that, would ministers look at reviewing the allocation of credits as well, and thinking about the college sector? I met recently with North East Scotland College and discussed their fantastic new net zero campus, which they're going to open. They will have no new credits, so they'll have to look towards all their provision. So it seems a bit ridiculous that that could then impact on other courses for what is a growing sector, and one the Scottish Government are saying we should be doing more to recruit students into.
So we're talking about purely in the context of the college sector now. It's an interesting question, because the work that's been done between the SFC and the sector has 3 phases, and the 3rd phase will be to look at credit allocation. But of course that's a thorny subject, Mr Briggs, and I'm sure that whilst you're advocating for NESCO, and I'm sure Mr Dunbar would as well, and others would advocate for their colleges getting more credits, I'm not sure that some of your fellow MSPs would be altogether happy if they were taken off another institution. So we need to be, alive to that. In the context of universities and the allocation of places, that we have done a bit of work in that space, and it's not been without its controversy, I should say. So Glasgow Caledonian University, for example, has attracted additional credits because it requires them, because of the level it's performing to. It's a thorny subject, and because there's a parallel with something we discussed earlier on in this session around the baseline and the rebaselining of the college funding. It was sought, it was delivered, with the warning there would be winners and losers, and those who've lost out have been far from happy. In fact, some of those who've benefited have been far from happy. So I just think we need to be alive to the pitfalls of doing that, but I absolutely understand the argument you make.
The committee's heard, I think, consistently around the skills gap we have in our economy, and need to do something different about that, especially in relation to the net zero agenda. Many companies are saying they would want to be part of funding that. So is there a new opportunity, a new funding model which ministers will look to increase the numbers of credits available in Scotland directly to fund these skill gaps? And there's several which haven't really been addressed in recent times. We know the conference recently, which I think was held in the Highlands and Islands in relation to the huge gap in that workforce, which is not going to be filled overnight.
The difference between a gap in a workforce and a skill shortage, because if we can train people, there will always be issues around recruiting numbers, not least of all because of Brexit. So we have to be careful about our language around this. I am acutely aware of the willingness of employers to make a contribution in some of these areas, and I'm very much open to that. We're encouraging our institutions to develop their thinking in that space. So there are opportunities here. I think one of the things that governments of all kinds have perhaps been guilty of is coming up with initiatives like free ports and city deals, etc., without necessarily allocating funds to build that extra capacity for the training into the system. Because we can't just magic up, as you've explained with UNESCO, you just can't magic up places. I think governments of all kinds need to get better at recognising that. But to your point about businesses, yes, there is an appetite to try and support that, and we're keen to see what we can do to tap into that.
Thank you. I understand there's a ministerial reshuffle going on, so wish you all well after this meeting. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Mr Briggs. And we move to Bill Kidd.
Thank you very much, Convener. And thanks to everyone for everything that's been said. I didn't actually ask Miles Briggs to drop that in because I don't think I'm one of the ones who's going to be in there. I'm only... You never know. No, you never... Well, you do, I think. Now, I haven't got an awful lot of things left to ask because there's been a lot covered today. However, can I ask what the government is currently doing to increase support for and recruitment into childminding? I mean, what actions are being taken just now and what actions are being planned as we go forward?
Thanks, Mr Kidd. Absolutely. So we have, so we know how important childminding is to our overall offering of childcare for families in Scotland. Childcare offers a really unique, flexible, as we've discussed this morning, an in-person sort of in-home offering for childcare. So we have worked with the Scottish Childminding Association to start a new pilot to recruit more childminders and equally to support more childminders as well. Now that is now in year 2, backed by investment from the Scottish Government, and it is proving really, really popular. Now I'll perhaps bring Andrew in a second just to speak to, I can't remember off the top of my head how many local authorities are currently involved in that programme, but I know that so far there has been interest from over 200 childminders, which, and I'm sure the committee is aware of some of the pressures facing the number of childminders and some of the difficulties in recruitment and retention for childminders. So as well as that programme being established to ensure that there is that flexibility and that quality for families in relation to accessing childcare, it's also very important in terms of looking at, as I alluded to, some of the different ways to supporting childminders, whether that be, you know, time off the floor to complete paperwork and things like that, looking at mentoring and things like that. So there are a number of actions being taken. Year 2 of the programme, we're seeing extremely positive impacts, and I'm really positive about where this is going to go further.
Just before you move on, can it, one of the big pressures being faced by private providers of all elements is the UK Government's increase in employer national insurance contributions. Do you think this is having an impact of any kind on the childminding procedure?
Well, I think that the ENICs, the contributions are extremely difficult for the childcare sector. So I know in relation to the PVI sector, the committee and the member will be aware that UK Government consequentials did not cover the funding for the PVI sector, and that is expected to add a substantial cost to providers, and that's something that's been directly brought to me from representatives of the childcare sector. So I'm actually very disappointed that this decision has been taken. I think across the nations we are working hard to try and improve the situation for childcare for both families and for providers in terms of those people who are out there supporting our children and trying to give them that best start in life. So there are huge consequences in relation to the ENICs contributions, but in Scotland we will continue. There are a number of ways that we are trying to to provide support to the sector. I've already spoken around what we're doing in relation to childminders, but a number of ways that we're looking to, or we are supporting the private providers as well. So we will continue with the actions that we're taking in Scotland, but as Mr Kidd rightly points out, that is going to have a very big impact on providers.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, were you going to?
Oh, sorry, I was going to bring you in about the childminding, Andrew. I'm too busy chatting.
I think you just asked about the number of local authority areas. It's 27 areas involved.
Okay, thank you. That's useful to know. Thank you and very much indeed, Minister. And can I ask one last wee question, which is that for me, which is not for the same Minister, it's for Mr Day, I believe. Can I ask what progress has been made in trying to improve industrial relations in the college sector? We all know about the funding elements, but in terms of industrial relations, is there any movement in that area?
Yeah, this is a topic that's come up at the committee on previous occasions. There's been an extensive effort made to try and tackle this thorny issue which has dogged the college sector for the best part of a decade. The positive in that is I think everyone involved recognises that continuing as they have been is not in any way to be welcomed, to put it mildly. I think there is a commitment to try and move this on. We did make considerable progress in terms of looking at what that might look like. We have progressed things to the point where trade unions have been working in conjunction with ACAS. There was a session that will look at behaviours across the whole of the national bargaining process. That work's still ongoing. There's been work undertaken with College Employers Scotland as well to review the current National Recognition Procedures Agreement and how that could be strengthened to support improving the nature of national bargaining. However, two of the trade unions have served notice that they intend to resign from the current NRPA as they don't feel it's fit for purpose anymore. And so that leaves two unions aligned on it, two moving away from it. So unfortunately, we have this kind of internal issue around trade union commitment to the processes. I would be deeply disappointed if we could not get this into a better space. I still see it as an imperative. I think the recognition is there on the part of all parties. Things have, touch wood, quietened down in the sector. We got a long-term agreement with the lecturers and the employers, and I know that negotiations with the support staff and the employers have been ongoing for some time now. So it's not much of an update, I'm afraid, Mr Kidd, but that's where we're at.
It's an active thing for the government to be involved in.
I think it's something I was very actively involved in for a period of time, but we're now in that kind of phase where things are happening behind the scenes or not to progress that, and you have reminded me to get back on top of that quite quickly.
Well, that was very useful. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Kidd. That's all the committee members have asked their initial questions. I'll go back to a few of them after we have heard from Liz Smith, who is joining us today. So over to Ms Smith.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary Kate Forbes made a very interesting speech last week when she talked about the essential need for economic growth in Scotland to be dependent upon good collaboration between the public and private sector for investment. And that was very much at the top of her speech at Panmure House. Can I ask what discussions have taken place within government circles about how there could be collaboration between the private and public sectors and investment within the education brief?
Can I ask, Convener, is there a specific area of the education brief that Ms Smith is interested in?
Well, I'm interested, Deputy First Minister has obviously set this out as part of government policy, which she's obviously put on the record in terms of the what she said in the Chamber, and Mr McKee has said that too. So I assume that that is government policy, quite rightly so in my opinion. So there must be areas within the education brief where there could be successful collaboration between the public and private sectors.
think there are examples from across the brief. I see Mr Day indicating, but Mr Logan has just reminded me of the Civitec work that he alluded to earlier on in relation to AI and the points Mr Greer raised in terms of reducing teacher workload. So that's an example of public-private collaboration in that space to try and drive a different approach to tackling an issue that has been an ongoing challenge, as we've heard from Mr Greer today. I don't know if Mr Day wants to come in from his perspective in terms of that public-private partnership approach.
Not so much public-private partnership approach, but facilitating additional incomes from the private sector. So in the college sector, one of the things we've been looking at is that there's been almost a ceiling hit in terms of the commercial income that our colleges have been able to secure. It just never rises above that. Some of our colleges have done very well in that space, Forth Valley, City of Glasgow. And we've been looking at what it is they do that is so successful that other colleges struggle with. One of the things we've identified is that there's just a lack of capacity, a lack of resource in some of our colleges to actually go out and have that engagement with the private sector, which is willing to put additional monies in, subject to getting the right kind of training for their workforce. So we are looking actively at what we can do to facilitate that, if that kind of answers your question.
It does perfectly, because what you're saying, Mr Day, is that it raises additional funds if it works properly. So, Cabinet Secretary, can I ask, does this apply to the field of outdoor education, where I have made the suggestion that there could be better partnerships between the private and public sector? Because that is a big ask of COSLA, as the Minister knows.
I understand that, and obviously Ms Donnan is leading on the bill, so I see she's indicated she wants to come in on this point, but we do want to progress our engagement, obviously, with Ms Smith on the bill, and I very much acknowledge the importance of outdoor education in my own responsibilities, but as a former teacher like Ms Smith in the classroom, we know it makes a huge difference. So I'll bring in Ms Donnan, who's been leading on the bill in that respect.
Thanks. I don't think I'm going to say anything I've not said before to Ms Smith, but I think she raises a really valid point, and I am very much in favour of leveraging private finance to support or supplement public finance. I think for me, and I believe my colleagues would be the same, especially in relation to outdoor education, this would definitely be a possibility. I think there are definitely private financiers who would welcome the opportunity to invest in this. But when it comes down to that statutory footing, so we need, when a private or a sort of public trust model, or some of the ways we've looked at this before, if that is to directly finance something that is on a statutory footing where we would have to be guaranteed that funding on a year-by-year basis, I think that poses some difficulties. However, I think, as my colleagues have alluded to, and I myself, in relation to outdoor education, there are definitely opportunities to do so.
COSLA were very clear at the time when they submitted evidence to the committee that in the area of capacity in the outdoor sector, that was an area where there could be potential for that. So I'm pleased to hear that the government still has that as an option, because that was obviously one of the concerns. Can I just ask briefly, Convener, two more things? The Minister very kindly has invited me to speak to her again, and that's a meeting where I've said to her already that I'll be bringing forward some proposed amendments. Can I just have it on the record that the Scottish Government at that meeting will be doing the same thing in terms of proposed amendments, because obviously that's what the committee's requested?
Absolutely.
Right, that's very good to hear. And assuming that all goes well, can I just ask again if we could have some confirmation that there would be scope to lay the financial resolution?
The Scottish Government will set out, our position around the financial resolution in due course. But I really do, I emphasise what I said earlier to Mr Ross, I believe it was, in relation to, I do feel like our conversations around this have been extremely productive. I think we have moved forward a lot in terms of where we were at the stage 1 debate, and I'll continue those discussions with Ms Smith.
That's very good to hear. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. We'll go back to Ross Greer.
Thanks very much, Convener. One of the areas that I was really proud to work with the Cabinet Secretary and our predecessor on was the expansion of access to counselling in school for children and young people in Scotland. And the Government produces a 6-monthly report on that, which I think shows the success of that policy in meeting what was previously an unmet need. But there's increasingly been a delay in those 6-monthly reports coming out. So the most recent one that we've got is for January to June 2023. It's got to the point where there's an 18-ish month delay before these reports are published, which does make it quite hard to scrutinise the implementation of that policy. There's some really, really useful data in them. So, for example, in that most recent one from the first half of 2023, it shows that twice as many girls are accessing counselling in school as boys. And I would suggest that girls don't have twice the mental health issue as boys, and that there's other underlying factors there that it would be worth us looking into. So I'm wondering if the Cabinet Secretary or officials have information to hand, that would be great. Given how specific this is, I'm not expecting that. So what I'm asking is if the Cabinet Secretary could look into why these reports have become so increasingly delayed that there's now what I hope will be an 18-month delay on the next one, because I hope it will be published soon. And if there was a way that we could significantly cut down on that to make sure we were getting more timely information and we could therefore start to analyse that and to look at what the access barriers are.
Well, I think, Convener, Mr Gray raised a really important point. The information should be published far more timely than it currently is. I am advised this is to do with us having to disaggregate all of the information to go back to local authorities. These things take time. We've also got evidence from community services and from schools, so we need to bring all of this together. But we should be able to do it more quickly than this. So I will take this away and speak to officials about how we might be able to do that. And the member raises a really important point in relation to the gender divide there, in terms of our boys not accessing counselling service in the same way our girls are. I think this speaks more broadly to changes in relation to society. We've talked today briefly about misogyny, about toxic masculinity. I'm worried about a generation of young boys who are growing up just now in an Andrew Tate society, and what more we can do to support them, whether that be through, yes, government approaches to the gender-based violence framework, but also through role models in schools. You know, we've got some fantastic male teachers in particular in our secondary schools, so it's really important for our young boys to have role models in their lives that they can relate to. And so when we talk about these gender splits, it's important we reflect on that data. So I'll take away both of these points on gender and on more timely publication of the data. To reassure the member, though, I am told that the coming data set will publish in the coming weeks.
That's great. I appreciate that. Thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. And Jackie Dunbar.
Thank you, Convener. If I can go back to the Minister for Higher and Further Education. Some of the evidence we've heard on the Withers review, well, we've had some opinions of the Withers review. Can I ask, the Withers review called for an audit of post-school qualifications. Can you update the committee on what progress has been made on that, if any?
Yes, if you give me a moment. There has been progress made on it because it's quite an important piece of work. It was an important ask of the Withers Review. So the work is underway. The initial stage of the project has included wide stakeholder engagement to inform and refine the scope of the project. We identified data collection requirements and work in partnership with relevant agencies and other stakeholders to ensure a solid evidence base. Data gathering is underway. The initial stage of the project that I've outlined is due to be completed in the coming weeks and will be followed by data collation and analysis and further, and I mean further, meaningful stakeholder engagement in this space, because there is no doubt that there is an appetite to tackle this issue, and it's imperative that we do. James Withers was absolutely right. Once we get through that, the final stage of the audit will focus on ensuring insights are available to inform that policy development, and there will be advice coming to ministers. But we absolutely recognise the need to move in this space to get this knocked into shape, because we hear it loud and clear, the concerns of stakeholders.
And will you keep the committee updated where appropriate?
More than happy to do that.
Thank you. That was my only question, Convener.
Thank you. And the final member I have seeking to come back in is Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Convener. And it's just a brief question, Minister, on the point about the trade unions and colleges. My understanding is that there has been some discontent about the way that perhaps support staff and others are represented in those negotiations. What is the government doing to get the best out of this, to make sure that the situation doesn't completely collapse? Because, of course, if that happens, nobody wins.
So, bluntly, I am not going to get dragged into trying to micromanage internal and cross-trade union relationships, because I think that's essentially, I think we both know that's what's at play here. But I will do everything within my power and my authority to encourage people to approach the process of resolving the long-standing issues in the sector as best as I can, but I'm not going to attempt to micromanage these issues.
Have you met the trade unions involved about this particular issue?
No, I have not. I had some correspondence from one trade union And I was very clear with them that this was a matter for the trade unions themselves. This is an internal mechanism, essentially, that lies behind the national bargain, and they really do need to get this sorted out between themselves, frankly.
And if they asked you to meet them, would you meet them?
As I said to you, I'm not going to be dragged into a disagreement between two trade unions. That is not the role of ministers. My job is to try and facilitate that overarching piece of work to get the industrial relations within the sector, not between trade unions, but within the sector, into a better place.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. Cabinet Secretary, Ministers and officials, can I thank you all for your time today? I think we've had a constructive, wide-ranging and productive meeting, so we are extremely grateful for that. And I will now conclude this part of our evidence session and the public part of proceedings. The committee will move into private session to consider its final agenda item, and I will briefly suspend for 5 minutes to allow our witnesses to leave. Thank you.